Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today I'm here with my good friend William Albrecht of Patristic Pillars. William, it's really awesome to have you on the channel again. And today we're discussing the topic of icon veneration, but specifically looking at Gavin Ortlund's presentation. But before we get there, William, how you doing?
I'm doing great, brother. Thrilled to be here with you. Can't think of a better way to pass my Friday evening. I've got a nice hot cup of coffee, a little bit more coffee down there. And I'm gonna get to talk theology with you, who I consider one of my closest and dearest brothers. You can't get any better, brother.
Yeah, William, I have so much respect for you. And the thing is, kind of to introduce what we're doing today. Obviously, I've been working a lot on the papacy on the side, working on my book. And so this issue of icon veneration kind of came out of left field. But I've been kind of absorbed and interested in it because at the same time, I've been researching the veneration of saints in Judaism and the use of images in Judaism. So then this all kind of nicely intersected into this issue. And I have to admit, my video that I did on my channel on icons and doctrinal development, this video was kind of, that video was not really meant to engage Gavin directly, but to provide people with how a response would work if you were to accept, like, let's say, the doctrinal development route. But I think, William, today you're going to give us something more substantive in that you're going to look directly at the presentation. And I think in this part, what we're aiming to do is just kind of see, is there more nuance to the quotes than what was presented? I know that the Catholic brothers in their video reviewing Gavin's presentation, they kind of thought, okay, some of these quotes are maybe a bit too short. Maybe some context is being cut out, other things like that. So
now I do want to add one thing, brother, and I want to be very fair in that I think a lot of Catholics are guilty of quote mining at times as well. Maybe not doing it intentionally, but at times, maybe posting a little tiny snippet of a quote. I know I've been guilty of that many years ago in the past, and I try to avoid that as much as can be now. Or if I do provide a tiny quote, I always just provide all of the surrounding content. So I want to be fair to Gavin there, and I also want to say that I don't think people should be offended at any of these presentations being put forth, because if after everything, if your faith is sharpened by this, which it should be, hey, you come out even stronger in the faith with a more robust love for the veneration of icons and images. And it's a win-win, brother. And I've been doing a lot of research, and I think I briefly told you that this particular topic for me came up a long time ago, and I've been doing research on it for almost 2 decades now, but learning new things all the time. And I'm just really thrilled to be able to be here with you and share what I have discovered as of late, as well as I've been talking with I have to give credit to my dear friend, Dr. Sebastian Brock. I've been in dialogue with him. Not only him, a lesser known figure that people don't really hear of a lot, but he's an expert when it comes to images and icons in Syriac Orthodoxy, be Dr. Harak. I've been talking with him a lot and just really learning a lot. By the way, these people I mentioned, they are not Catholic, but it helps to learn other perspectives and to say, okay, well, they have this to say. I want to hear it. I want to learn. Can I learn? And yes, there's always new ways of learning and being able to appreciate. You've got to be able to understand your opponent's position. If you don't, well, you're never going to make any ground.
Yeah, and some people were worried about, oh, well, you guys don't have Gavin on the stream. That's not fair. And I'm like, well, Gavin did a response video without Jimmy and Trent on his channel, and so I'm not holding that against Gavin at all. I'm saying that it's not a necessary standard. Now, there is a point, though, wherein eventually you should have a dialogue one-on-one with the other person. But I think right now we're still kind of in the responding phase and getting things kind of set out. But no doubt. With that being said, William, what I'm going to do is I'll sometimes see if I can play Gavin's advocate and kind of push a little bit maybe on some of your quotes. I want to be fair to Gavin in this presentation. And
one other thing I'd also add for people that may be wondering, we've got a lot of great material for you that we're likely going to break. Actually, not likely. We're gonna, God willing, break it up into 2 parts. So if at the end of the show, I really recommend people help out with the algorithm. Comment down below. And if there's something you say, well, you know what, Suan or William, I think you guys really misrepresented the position here. Let us know. We promise you we'll do our best to get to it in the second part. Let us know your thoughts. The best, even if you just like the show, please comment down below for the algorithm, for the brothers channel to grow. The best way for it to grow and for people to be able to see the video when they search for it is to comment down below. Like, share, and comment. It goes a real long way.
Yeah, well, William, I'm ready to get the presentation started if you are.
I definitely am, brother. I think you can cue it up there. I am excited. I want to go through the list. Yes, so we're going to begin with, and every now and then I'm pulling up my my notes so people see my screen flash just because I'm pulling them up. I want to be fair to everything here. Every now and then, what I am going to do is I am going to play a video clip of something that Gavin has said. In particular, right now, we're going to go in order, more or less, because sometimes Gavin, and he doesn't do it maliciously, will hop ahead in terms of church fathers. So we're going to pretty much touch upon every early church father that Gavin believes presents a case against icons, or I don't want to call them iconophobic. I don't want to use that kind of language, but perhaps fathers that Gavin believes were kind of strictly against the utilization of images or statues or any kind of representation of art. And we have a few of them that he does bring up. You know, there really is not a lot of context. And one of them is Manicius Felix. And this is a direct screenshot from Gavin's video. And there really isn't a lot of detail. Gavin doesn't go into a lot of detail. And we don't either, because I think the answer is right there in the quote itself. And really, let me read it. It says, "Why do they endeavor with such pains to conceal and to cloak whatever they worship? Why have they no altars, no temples, no acknowledged images?" So what Manicius Felix here is doing here, he is criticizing the worship being given to images, worship being given to idols. He's not talking about the proper utilization of images or art or representation in Christian worship. But I also want to add one other thing, Suan. A number of the fathers that we're going to look at, like Manicius Felix, which does not present a case against Christian iconography. He may not present a case against it, but he doesn't also present a case for it. Multiple of these figures that Gavin brings up merely are talking about condemnation of giving worship to idols, pagan idolatry, and what have you. A number of them don't give a positive case for the utilization of images in Christian worship. They don't really even touch upon it because that is not the topic of what a lot of them are talking about. I want to be very clear. St. Justin the Martyr is condemning idol usage among the pagans. Manicius Felix is doing the very same thing. But you do not have them on the flip side presenting a positive case. So there's a reason why these particular fathers were never utilized at the Second Council of Nicaea. Either which way, they just don't present a case either which direction.
Yeah, there are two things I want to say here. I think the first is, at least as I articulated in my own presentation, it seems as if with the way that Gavin presented the sources, and I mean, there's a question here on did he intend for it to be a comprehensive? I mean, obviously it's not meant to be a comprehensive history, but it gives the impression that there was a time when the church was totally aniconic, if not like totally iconoclastic, right? So I think what you're showing with what you just said there was, okay, even if you don't have, let's say, a positive endorsement of images, the idea that, let's say, there was a block of Christians, you know, one time in history that were totally aniconic or iconoclastic, that's a bit of an over exaggeration, right? Which is an impression that one could get from the video. It might not be Gavin's intention, so I want to lay that out. I'm not saying anything about
I do want to respond to that by saying that I think that was Gavin's intention. I don't at one point in the video, and I can pull up the actual quote, and I thought it was quite odd. And in fact, let me pull it up right here. At one point, and I can even say where. In fact, as I said the last time, let me be fair to Gavin. Let me play the clip because I do have the video. It's at the 11:50 mark, and then we'll go right back to this because he does make a comment that I found to be a little bit odd.
A couple of issues.
And I really object to this. So let's look at around the 11, and I found this to be very historically inaccurate. It's right around here.
Is in fact the
This is a very strong statement. So for Gavin to make this statement, you're going to have to present your information. I don't think he's able to make this case. And it's right here we go.
The position anathematized at Nicaea II as a damnable heresy is in fact the universal, resounding witness of the early church and the scripture.
That to me is a pretty strong statement from Dr. Ortlund, particularly saying that veneration of icons, images, utilization of these images and icons, because that is what is mentioned there at Nicaea II, that the church was universally against that. That is a very strong statement. And I cannot find, correct me if I'm wrong, I hope you do. I wish you would have nuanced that. I don't think he did. That's a pretty clear kind of statement. What are you, am I hearing it? Am I understanding it incorrectly?
Yeah, I think what Gavin's going to say, or what Gavin's position is, and he says this very clearly in the video, that he's basically in the same camp as like Pope Gregory. His position is that images are okay. You can have them in churches, but you can't venerate them. And so he would take even fathers or figures who are aniconic to also be against veneration. And so that's how he gets the idea that then there was a universal opposition to veneration prior to Nicaea.
Yeah. And I think for the audience that may not know, don't be let down. In part 2, we're going to present the positive case, which, by the way, is going to be, in my opinion, a very robust case with multiple quotes. By the way, by the time we do that, I will have multiple other quotes that are nowhere else in English right now that will be provided for us. Some Syriac fathers. I am excited. And on Suan's show right here will be the very first time you hear them in English. So I think that a very positive case can be made for that. So, but today, as for people may be wondering, we are dealing with the fathers that are mentioned that apparently were against images, against veneration of images. We hear of Saint Clement of Alexandria. Now, this one, Suan, I thought was very much taken out of context, because you only get a little tiny little quote there. Works of art cannot then be sacred and divine. Now, Gavin will present that little tiny quote, and then no context at all. He will then hop into saying that Clement of Alexandria and Origen of Alexandria both were against images in Christian worship. But I think that the context here is very different than what Gavin is presenting. In fact, if you look at the context, which, by the way, this is a little tiny piece played in Gavin's video, you can find the whole context. All you have to do is go to Stromata 7 on New Advent. It's free. You can find out what is Saint Clement actually talking about. And let me read the whole quote. It were indeed ridiculous, as the philosophers themselves say, for man, the plaything of God, to make God, and for God to be the plaything of art, since what is made is similar and the same to that of which it is made, as that which is made of ivory is ivory, and that which is made of gold, golden. Now, the images in temples, so what's he talking about? He's talking about those that make God. These are idols that he's talking about. Images in temples constructed by the mechanics are made of inert matter. He's combating the idea that idolatry is acceptable, saying so that they too are inert, immaterial, and profane. And if you perfect the art, they partake of mechanical coarseness. Works of art cannot then be sacred and divine. Now, what is the context? The context is you cannot make any of these images, any of these statues to be God. They are not God. They are made, they are created matter. And he's saying that to make God is condemnatory. So the context of works of art are not sacred and divine is very clearly referring to what he is condemning as idolatry, making a God similar, Suan, to Exodus, I want to say Exodus 31 or 32, I believe 32, where after the golden calf is made, people say to Aaron, this is your God. We hear, this is our God. This is your God that took us out of the land of Israel. That's very much along the same lines of what he's condemning here.
Yeah, I mean, looking at this quote, I'm just kind of like, I really see what you're saying here, especially when you're talking about making something that is obviously created, like, or just a piece of artwork, to make that God, or at least maybe what they're talking about here are people who are trying to depict, let's say, God the Father, which is also something that we condemn, right? Because I mean, well, it depends on who you talk to, but the idea of like God the Father is the invisible God, and the image of the invisible Father is the Son, So right now, once again, I'm not seeing something that would necessarily count against, the veneration of the distinction that we have as Catholics with the veneration of images.
Sure. Yeah. And I want to let the audience know, because I did a similar presentation over on the Brother Sam's channel. But one thing that I was very pressed for time there, I kind of hopped over multiple ecclesiastical figures. When I say ecclesiastical, I mean figures that are not reckoned as church fathers, Tertullian, Eusebius. We're going to look at those today. We are, because I want to give Gavin credit in one particular point. Even Origen as well. Even if a number of these ecclesiastical figures, even if they are not venerated within any of the apostolic churches, there was a period of time where they were very highly regarded. And even Tertullian in later years was highly regarded. Origen was highly regarded as well. And he was a fantastic Greek teacher. So even though they're not church fathers, if they were anti-icon, anti-image, we've got to look at, okay, well, Tertullian was of North Africa, Origen of Alexandria. Does that mean that the churches of the region were also anti-image at the time? We have to give a fair treatment to Gavin's material, and I think that is the goal that we're gonna delve in. But before we hop on over to those, we're not done with Saint Clement, because even on the flip side, even though there is nothing negative here, Saint Clement does present a positive case. Now, I said. I want to be very clear. We're not going to do a whole show on all of the positive evidence, but at times it is necessary to provide the rebuttal. So in this instance, and in a few others, we'll look at the flip side of it. And you do have a positive case. By the way, I have looked at probably 4 different translations and commentaries on the Instructor, including commentaries by Dr. Booker, where he's written on St. Clement of Alexandria. I wanted to be fair with the translation to make sure. I know you can find it on New Advent, but is there anything more robust or updated? And the English is perfectly in line. There's nothing that is interpolated or any kind of corruption in the text. And it indeed does read. And by the way, even though on the top I wrote late 100s, early 200s, you even have liberal scholarship, a massive amount of them, that will argue that this particular work is late 100s. And if that is the case, we have late 2nd century evidence of very positive utilization of images. And you read, if it is necessary for us, while engaged in public business or discharging other avocations in the country, and often away from our wives, to seal anything for the sake of safety, he, the word, the logos, allows us a signet for this purpose only. Let our, and this is kind of, I should have bolded it, should be emphatic for our presentation. Let our seals be either a dove or a fish, and we know very well. I know there are other representations. People a few days ago told me, well, look at what all these represent. I know that, but for time's sake, I mentioned how the dove, even from antiquity, has always been representative of the Holy Spirit, even in Scripture. Or a ship scudding before the wind, or a musical lyre, which Polycrates used, or a ship's anchor, with Seleucus, God engraved as a device. And if there be one fishing, he will remember the apostle. So some of these things should bring to your memory these holy men of old, and the children drawn out of the water. For we are not to delineate the faces of idols. So there's a proper way of having images in Christian utilization, in Christian usage. And then there is a condemnation of do not make the faces of idols. Because at the time of St. Clement of Alexandria, there were still problems of faces of the emperors, problems of these kinds of idols that were still being stumbled upon and were a stumbling block amongst the faithful. So he does draw the distinction, Suan, and I'd like to get your thoughts on that. Because when I read it, and I've read it over and over, and I have read a particular author, multiple ones that were quoted by Gavin, and one of them puts Clement as a positive figure for the utilization of icons and veneration of images. And you also have Dr. Price as well, who, by the way, you can go and see a show we did, who also says St. Clement of Alexandria is very clear that there is a positive, proper way to be able to utilize images in the early church. I'd like to get your thoughts on that, Suan.
Right. So when we compare what's being said here to the original quote that Gavin presented, which is that, quote, works of art cannot then be sacred and divine, end quote. Obviously, well, then in that context, it's trying to turn basically an image into God, right? Or try to drag God into an image, right? Or either way. And then here, what this is saying is we can use images in a positive way. Correct. Now, when Clement talks about an image being sacred and divine, right? Gavin could say, okay, so I'll agree with you that Clement's saying that the image can't be divine, but it can't be sacred either, right? And so maybe that's the way that he would try to show that, okay, Clement can say here that images are okay, but he's not saying that they're sacred, right, as something to be venerated. And at that point, then it's like, well, maybe with the original sacred and divine, that's supposed to be read together.
Right.
And then here with Clement of Alexandria, talking about how images can be used for a positive reason, to call to mind, to remember the apostle, as he says it, right? Or to remember events of the Old Testament, like the children drawn out of water. Yes. I'm assuming he's talking about the parting of the Red Sea there.
Right. Yes, I believe so.
Yeah. Regardless, right? Images can have a positive usage. And so he's not aniconic.
Yeah, and I think that is the key point there. To be very clear, there are way more robust examples that we will present in part 2. But I think the flip thing is to show that St. Clement of Alexandria is not an enemy of images or icons. Rather, a positive case can be made for their utilization in the Christian life. And I don't think the texts that were presented by Gavin, I don't think they, when we examine them, because we need to look at the context of everything. And I think when we do look at that context, Suan, I don't think he has anything when it comes to St. Clement of Alexandria. And he would have a prominent early church father venerated East and West if he did. I'm very clear today he is still venerated in Eastern churches, some of them. Now, I know his veneration dropped off at a period of time around the time of Photius the Great. Now we won't go into that controversy today, but I think by and large, a lot of people are re-examining St. Clement and realizing the reason why largely his veneration dropped off was largely because of a lot of pseudonymous texts that people thought were from him that had a low and a very poor Christology. And even today, I'm not aware of any scholar that believes that those texts are legitimately from him. So just a little tiny remark in case we have any of our Eastern friends that might be tuning in and might say, well, hey, he is not a saint for us. There are a lot of Eastern churches that are now reevaluating that kind of information.
Yeah. And once again, for people who watched my original presentation, the way that I classified the chart made it look as if Clement of Alexandria was on the no images side or something like that, if I recall properly. And what I want to emphasize here is, okay, Gavin might be saying, hey, but he's still not saying no veneration. He's still saying no veneration. I'm like, okay, maybe not. That's a bit more kind of up in the air, I would say, at this point. But the point is that there was not a time in the history of the church where people were universally opposed to images.
Yeah.
Okay, so images were always part of our history. That's the point that I want to get across.
Yeah, and I think another thing that that Gavin, I don't think he brought out very well on his presentation was, at one point he begins talking about the lack of evidence of veneration and honor being given to images, which of course goes to the figure being represented. But and at one point he goes and he says, well, you don't have any. What you really have lacking are people giving the proskuneo, which is prostration. But I want to be very clear. If you're going to be fair to the Catholic treatment, to the Orthodox treatment, even the Syriac Orthodox treatment, proskuneo, bowing is not the only kind of veneration. It's not the only way to venerate, to give veneration in the strict biblical language context of the scriptures in the early church. And Nicaea too was very clear. Nicaea too, in its dialogue, never once said, well, you know what, the exclusive form of giving veneration must be you've got to bow down before. Now, I know he brought up the Acta, which we'll look at later, that talks about kissing icons and what have you. But in the dogmatic decrees, we're not pigeonholed into a certain kind of way to where, hey, we've got to do this kind of veneration. Now, there are multiple ways to venerate. And I think that's one kind of point that was lost and I didn't find in Gavin's presentation. I wish you would have been a little clearer on that.
There's one thing I want to say here too, William. Sorry to insert myself again.
Yeah, definitely.
But, people have talked about how, some people would not want to classify this under doctrinal development, but under cultic development, because the underlying doctrine would be something like the veneration of saints, which is what I basically kind of have said on my channel. There might be other doctrines that you could talk about, like, for example, how created things can be used to honor God. So you have a whole sacramental theology, the incarnation, right?
Definitely.
The honor that we give to Christ's flesh also goes to his deity, his invisible deity, all that.
Absolutely.
But so the point I want to make here is, I think the issue at hand really is the veneration of saints.
Yeah.
Can you bow to a saint? Can you, kiss them? And then the question that I think Nicaea II took on was, can that the cult of the veneration of saints include images?
Yeah.
That's what was really going on. And so, I've noticed that, people in the comments are kind of talking about the issue of veneration. And it's like, yeah, I think that's where the issue has to that's the next thing that we have to debate. But I mean, you and I both know that there's a very robust attestation of the veneration of saints among the church fathers. Yeah,
no doubt. And Suan, you bring up such a great case. I remember about 8-9 years ago, I was debating Francis Tertullian of Alpha and Omega Ministries on a radio show. And I remember towards the end of the show, he made this comment. He said, we've had a lot of fun debating veneration of images. We have to have another debate because they're pretty much connected. And he said, we have to have the debate of veneration of saints. And he's right. Even he recognized that. By the way, Alpha and Omega Ministries, a very well-respected Reformed Protestant group of individuals that do work defending their particular Reformed view, but they go connected. Suan, that's a very good point there, because and Gavin criticized the Catechism, saying that it is taking Basil out of context, but it isn't, because in that, by the way, that is a legit quote where Basil talks about giving honor. The honor of the image goes to the prototype. That is exactly what Nicaea II was talking about. And that is exactly what was echoed at Trent. And in fact, I've got the text translated where Trent echoes that any kind of veneration that you're offering it directly to the saint being represented, whether it be, let me use the Clement as an example, or Holy Mother Mary. You are giving that veneration to the saints. And can we find that biblically? Are you allowed to proskuneo, to give bowing prostration to a creature? Yes. You find it all over the Bible. And then on the flip side, the other Greek word, duliuo, dulia in the Latin. Are you allowed to give dulia to a creature? Yes. The book of Galatians is very clear. You are to serve, duliuo, serve one another in love. So you find it all over the Bible. We do not give latria to these creatures. Latruo, the Greek worship, which is to God and God alone. But ultimately, as you pointed out, Suan, the discussion has got to be, can we venerate the saints? And can we do it in a religious context? I would argue, Suan, my argument is, because I know the flip side argument, I've heard it from Dr. White and from Francis Tertullian, they will say, well, okay, duliuo and proskuneo, yeah, you can give it. You're able to give veneration to creatures, but not in a religious context.
Right.
So, and that's in my opinion, their next level argument where they will combat it and use that. But to me, Suan, anything that includes love is as religious as you can get in a context. And we're directly told in the scriptures to serve one another in love. Yeah. So I think the Catholics have a very robust case for this.
I mean, and there's so much that can be said. As you point out in the Old Testament, people were bowing and kissing each other. Yeah. Family members, that was the way of showing love. Like when Moses sees his father-in-law Jethro, it says he bowed and kissed him. Yeah. And then in what was it? It's either, I think it's in First Chronicles or Second Chronicles. I remember I mentioned this. It's like 29:20. And I remember Sam, he brought that up when you appeared on his channel.
Right. Yeah. I'm trying to remember. I think it was first. I might be wrong there.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. Actually, let me just pull it up. But the point I think it's First Chronicles.
It is. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so you had well, let me just read it actually. So to not repeating what Sam did. Sorry. But it says in First Chronicles 29:20, then David said to all the assembly, Now bless the Lord your God. And all the assembly blessed the Lord, the God of their fathers, and bowed down and paid homage to the Lord and the king.
Yeah.
And some translations, will say bowed at low and prostrated themselves to Yahweh and to the king.
Yeah.
So in the single act of, let's say, religious submission to God, the king was also involved, right? Now, obviously, you have to say somehow that the King David was not elevated into the status of Yahweh, right? You want to be careful about that, because obviously then that would be a serious sin. But somehow in the Bible, it was acceptable to do that in a religious context, to also venerate a living human being.
Yeah,
so,
no doubt. That and I think that is a very important passage, a very key one. And I remember Alpha and Omega pretty much admitting that you've got to get into the weeds there, looking at the grammar of the text. But I remember when I was debating Tertullian and that he kind of said, it's a little bit tough on his end to kind of combat that. But I think that's a great text there, a really good one. I think there are many others. You alluded to just really many passages where you've got the individuals bowing before one another. So all of that is definitely acceptable. And here's the other thing, Suan. The other thing that will be at times thrown in our face will be, well, where do you draw the line? When does it become worship? I've heard it very often, Suan, where I've been to a lot of these parishes in Mexico. And in fact, I was on a Catholic show a few years ago where the host was just really chastising the Mexican culture for their incredible devotion and love to Holy Mary. Where he then said, well, where do you draw the line? When does it become latria? When does it become worship? Well, I think the people would know if they are giving worship, if they are elevating Mary to a deity. And I've never met a Mexican person do that before, or a Hispanic person ever. I have never met them. Rather, I meet them having an incredibly massive love and devotion for Holy Mary, but all the while recognizing we worship God and God alone. So I think people are able to make that distinction. And we need to be careful before we claim that we can read people's hearts and accuse them of idolatry.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that I can say here, but it would kind of make us go a little off topic. So, William, I'll let you continue on with your presentation.
Yeah, definitely. And now let's look at Tertullian. Tertullian, I want to, from the outset, note that when I was in Sam's show, I avoided Tertullian for the sake of time, and also because Tertullian is not an early church father. Now, people will then say, well, William, you know what? He was very well respected. Sure, I grant that. But you come to a period in the life of Tertullian where his Christology really drops off massively. It's very odd. I don't know. And I've never ever read a scholar that has really ever put forward a case as to why. Could it be because of the cult of the Montanists that he joined? I don't know. But his the way he talks about Holy Mary, it becomes a very low kind of Mariology. His Christology, in my opinion, becomes very poor. The way he talks about the divinity of the Son, I find that to be deficient. And all of this happens either once he's already become a Montanist, and then he's full-blown Montanist already. So in each of these here that we look at, modesty and on idolatry, he's already a Montanist here. I am not sure. I think on idolatry, if I'm correct, or I might be getting them mixed up. In either one of these, he's already well into his post-Montanist phase, to where he's just really has nothing at all positive to say about the church. I think it's an idolatry. But let's look at them. On modesty, he says, that shepherd will play the patron whom you depict upon your sacramental chalice. Depict, I say, as himself withal a prostituter of the Christian sacrament, worthily both the idol of drunkenness and the prize of adultery, by which the chalice will quickly be followed. A chalice from which you sip nothing more readily than the flavor of the hue of your second repentance. The other quote is one you don't hear very often, but it is another attack. And you can, by the way, both of these, I got them both from New Advent. This one you can find in New Advent. Idol artificers are chosen even into the ecclesiastical order. Oh, wickedness. A little bit of humor there, because in the second quote, he's clearly attacking the Catholic Church by claiming that even people that make images, they're idol worshipers, and they're part of the order of the church, and they are wicked. Now, Tertullian is not a positive witness in this state, but let me be very clear, though. He has very negative things to say about images here, but he presents a very positive case because he's not part of the church anymore. He has visibly left. Tertullian is not like Origen. He visibly leaves the church. He becomes a full-blown Montanist, and his testimony is indicative of the fact that within the church he is attacking. He also attacks the papacy in a very important way. He's a positive testimony that they are utilizing images, and they're utilizing them in worship. You can see that on modesty, and even on idolatry. So he is a positive case because of the way he is attacking, the claims he is making. Now, let me also flip that over. Even though I don't present that today, we will present it in part 2. Tertullian is not all anti-image. A lot of them, many places, many of them, he presents a robust case where he defends the utilization of images of biblical scenes or biblical events. In this particular area, he's very anti-icon, very anti-image, but that is not always the case. Tertullian is a figure that, unfortunately, he goes back and forth. He really is inconsistent. But in any case, even if we want to take the position that Tertullian is anti-image at the end of the day, he presents a positive case because of the way he's attacking the Catholic Church. I'd like to get your thoughts on that, Suan.
So basically what you're saying is he's a very vocal minority, if not maybe the only person who has this really extreme opinion. And if you can read between the lines, if you will, you see that he's kind of admitting that this is common practice, that let's say there are images on the sacramental chalice and other things as well. And that the idol artificers, and for him, I guess, it depends, as you put it, right? I mean, did he think any image counted as an idol or whatever? But he's saying, look, somehow there are idol artificers in the church.
Yeah.
Right. And so, we don't know what exactly that means, if it actually means that they were worshiping, like a pagan, or it just means that they had images in their liturgy. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I think it, and to be fair, Gavin could very well come back and say that. But I think when you read the context, he definitely is not talking about any kind of pagan images being utilized within particular churches. I don't think that's the case. I think he's accusing the church of being idolaters simply by having images. I think that really is the case. And to your point there, Suan, I think that Tertullian is a massively vocal minority because you have who follows him in his see. It's Cyprian of Carthage, and you don't have this in Cyprian of Carthage. He speaks positively of people that do make images. He talks in a positive way, even though he doesn't. He's not a witness for veneration of images. You don't find this in Cyprian of Carthage, and there's a lot that Tertullian particularly had within his theological spectrum that you don't find in Cyprian of Carthage. And I think when Cyprian took over that see, I don't think that he took over everything. I think Tertullian was definitely had visibly left the church, and I think those within the church fathers, I think they knew that.
And William, let me just kind of read Gavin's the quote that he used from his video. So he says, "But when the devil introduced into the world artificers of statues and of images, and of every kind of likeness or likenesses, the former rude business of human disaster attained from idols both a name and a development. Thenceforth, every art which in any way produces an idol instantly becomes a fount of idolatry." Okay, so there's actually some vagueness there, right? Because you could say, oh, we agree, right, as Catholics, that any art which in any way produces an idol, right, becomes a fount of idolatry, sure, right? And then when he says the devil introduced into the world artificers of statues and of images, that almost sounds like he's universally condemning artwork.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a question here on, how wide we want to read Tertullian. But I mean, if we go with the more strict reading, right, which is kind of what the end says, that every art which in any way produces an idol, okay, then we can agree with him there. That's not a problem for our position.
Sure.
But then he thinks, however, having images in liturgy is idolatry, right? But he would notice that he's speaking as a minority, a very vocal minority, but a minority at that. So images were already in liturgy by Tertullian's time.
humongously important point you make there. They were already present in the liturgy. And remember, the main objection there at Nicaea too was the utilization of these images in worship. Remember, I want to be very clear for the audience. Pay attention to what I'm saying. Not worship. They were not worship, but their usage in worship. This very clearly shows they were being used. And again, if we, to be very fair to Gavin, let's say Gavin says, Suan and William, take it at face value. Every image is an idol for him. Okay, if you want to go down that route, you have a problem, because multiple times Tertullian presents images in a positive light. So at worst, if we want to go down that road, Tertullian is inconsistent. And even at that, it would fit his very poor theology once he becomes a Montanist, where it really does seem like his Christological positions are just, to be very nice, a bit of a mess.
Yeah.
So,
well, William, I'm ready. I'm done with this. Mm-hmm.
So we got Augustine. Here's a good one. And the reason I think this is an important one is because we have a very robust defense of veneration of saints in St. Augustine. So what is Augustine doing here? He says, but have they mouth and yet speak not? Have they eyes and see not? Do we pray to them? Because through them we pray to God. This is the chief cause of this insane profanity, that the figure resembling the living person, which induces men to worship it, hath more influence in the minds of these miserable persons than the evident fact that it is not living, so that it ought to be despised by the living. I know the exact argument Gavin makes. He says Augustine was a forerunner of what the iconoclasts were condemning at Second Nicaea. He's saying right there, not only is he condemning idols, he is saying that even if you pray to them, thinking your prayer is going to go to God, this is idolatry. But if we begin to unwrap it, Augustine has in mind idols, period. That's exactly what he has in mind. Even when Augustine touches upon the event in Exodus, and even when we examined it earlier, let me give you an example, Suan. It would be improper, even if we were to bring forth a golden calf and say, okay, well, any kind of honor being given to this calf ultimately is going to go to God. There is no kind of a representation there of God. Rather, that is an idol. And that's exactly what Augustine's talking about. Notice what he says. Have they mouth and yet speak not? So they don't talk. Have the eyes and see not? Do we pray to them because through them we pray to God? He's condemning the idea that these living kinds of idols are being given this kind of power, when in reality they are not gods and they're being worshipped as gods. That is exactly what he's condemning. And I think if we look at the context of what Augustine is condemning, any Catholic would give a hearty amen to that.
Yeah, I mean, I could see Gavin kind of pushing back and saying, look, Augustine's saying that you can't treat these images as if they were their living prototypes, right? Because the images themselves are what they have in their liturgy. Because Augustine does talk about how he's responding to someone who's accusing them of being pagans because they have images in their worship, right?
Right.
Right. He's saying, well, we pray unto them because through them we pray unto God. So that to me seems kind of like a strong, Augustine saying, no intercessory prayer, which is, well, through the image, right? Mm-hmm. But then, then you'll have a quote by Augustine where he then talks about how, venerating saints is not idolatry. So, I want to share that quote, but I want to get your thoughts on that, because it seems like he's saying you can't treat the image like it's its living counterpart.
Yeah. So on the flip side, you make a great point there. Gavin could definitely say, well, look, there's a clear problem here. But at the end of the day, what exactly is Augustine talking about? To me, there would be such a robust case if perhaps he was talking about Christian artwork or artwork within Christian worship. The problem is this is pagan. This is a pagan idol. He's very clear there that that this particular figure, let me give an example, because multiple fathers do use this as an example. Perhaps Julius Caesar or any other pagan figure, the kind of condemnation being given there is the idea that any kind of honor being given to that pagan idol is ultimately idolatry, because they're viewing that figure as a god. And any kind of veneration, even any mere veneration, all amounts to idolatry of that particular figure. And I think the important thing is, notice right there, he says, the figure resembling the living person induces men to worship it. He's talking about a mere creature, and people, by virtue of this pagan idol, are worshiping it. I think that's the major difference when we talk about Christian artwork and giving honor and veneration to the saints. Rather, this is an idol because people are giving latria to it. They're worshiping it.
Yeah. So then the question here is, because maybe I'm misremembering how Gavin used the quote, right? But I remember somewhere in my mind, I have this idea that Augustine is responding to the accusation that the way in which the Christians use images in their liturgy is pagan, and then Augustine saying, "Oh no, it's not, because we don't pray unto them because as a way to pray unto God." Does that make sense on kind of where my confusion might be coming from?
You know, I would have to go back and hear Gavin. I don't know if Gavin I don't think Gavin made that case from what I remember, and I could be wrong. After the show, I'll go back and hear. From what I remember Gavin saying, I think Gavin was saying that Augustine's statement here pretty much sounds a lot like the anti-icon, those iconoclasts of Nicaea II, and their condemnations that they were levying towards actually pretty much saying that you cannot venerate images and statues because it pretty much amounts to idolatry. I could be wrong on that. I don't remember exactly what he says in Augustine, but I vaguely remember that. But if somebody in the audience says, you know what, this is what Gavin was saying, I'd be willing to look at that again.
Well, so I have the full quote here now because I looked it up on New Advent. So it says
from Augustine.
Yeah. So Augustine says, but it will be said, we also have very many instruments and vessels made of materials or metal of this description for the purpose of celebrating the sacraments, which being consecrated by these ministrations are called holy in honor of him who is thus worshipped for our salvation. And what indeed are these very instruments or vessels but the work of men's hands? But have they mouth and yet speak not? Have they eyes and see not? Do we pray unto them because through them we pray to God? This is the chief cause of the insane profanity. And then, we have the rest of the quote already on it there. But okay, so, the interesting thing here is that when he talks about, so I think one thing you could say is that Augustine doesn't think that you can use, let's say, the images in the liturgy, like the images that you have on the chalice, and let's say, well, then the other question is, okay, so you can't pray unto them, to pray to God, right? So that might work in Gavin's favor, that part. And then when we talk about which induces men to worship it, okay, well, depending on what worship exactly means, we would agree with Augustine here, right? Because obviously you don't want then the chalice itself to become, in your eyes, God, right? That wouldn't, right? That's not okay even with us. So yeah, I mean, but I do see Augustine. So I mean, we do have very robust evidence, right, that Augustine believed in the veneration of saints. It seems like here he might be, well, it seems like he's very cautious about praying to God through an image, right? At least to God himself, right? That might be the concern that he has.
So my pushback would be, I think I heard you say, correct me if I'm wrong, that Augustine seemed to be against an image on a chalice. I kind of didn't understand you there. What was the point of the image? Did you say an image on a chalice?
So I think what Gavin is saying is that Augustine agrees that you can have images in churches, right?
Okay.
But he agrees with Augustine, apparently, that you cannot pray to the image to pray to God. You can't pray to God through that image. I think that's what he's saying there, and that's what Augustine's saying there. Do we pray unto them because through them we pray unto God? Right.
So my question would be, because I've read it multiple times, I don't see Augustine claiming that we cannot pray to that we cannot direct prayer towards God through an image. I read it very differently. So the way that I look at it, the way that I read it is his chief condemnation here is the giving worship through what I would believe his condemnation of the actions and the practices of those pagans. I don't see his, I don't see the kind of, I don't see him bringing Christian artwork into the conversation and then saying, okay, any kind of honor or veneration, it should not be done. I don't find that to be there in the text. Maybe I'm just not reading it as clear as you are. Maybe give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think this is something worth looking into more because I'm looking at the quote again. Let's see, because it sounds like, at least from your perspective, you're emphasizing the part where it says, which induces men to worship it, right? And you're saying like, oh, okay, so this is like a pagan backdrop that he's responding to, right?
Yeah.
Whereas
that's what I gathered from reading the full context, but I'd be willing to go back and look at it.
Yeah, because
because
it looks like, as I mentioned before, the part that I read,
you found that on New Advent, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Exposition on Psalm 115. Someone might, because what he's doing is he's responding to this accusation, I guess, from pagans that, hey, you have instruments and vessels and you have images, right? So isn't that kind of, let's see here.
Here's what I see.
Yeah.
And I remember it now. I'm glad I popped it up. I'm glad I brought it up. So I think the whole context is against idols. And because if you read before that,
I see.
Yeah, he's condemning idols. He says, the idols of the Gentiles are gold and silver. Yeah. And then he goes forward and he says, employ not the hands of men to create a false deity out of that metal which a true God has created. And he says, nay, a false man whom you may worship for a true God. So it's definitely condemnation there, pagan idolatry. I'm glad you brought me to that because I'd forgotten the context of that. So I really truly do think that that's the context. I don't think Gavin presents the full context of that.
Right. I think, so I'm just going to say this. I think what Gavin's going to say is, I agree with everything you just said, William. I concede all of it, right? The thing is, though, for Augustine, he thinks that if you pray unto the image as a means to pray unto God, then that is illegitimate.
So
that would count. Yeah.
And the Catholic would offer pushback by saying, you have no example of Augustine condemning that. You have him condemning this idolatry that is going on there. Clearly, there's no evidence that Augustine is condemning the proper utilization in Christian worship, such as veneration, if you will. Rather, he's condemning pagan idolatry or idolatry completely. So I think the Catholic could offer a good pushback on that simply by virtue of the context. Would you think that would be perhaps a viable way a Catholic could answer?
Well, I'll say this. I think Gavin's going to really press on, do we pray unto them because through them we pray unto God? Right. That's the key thing that he's going to hit in this particular paragraph.
Yeah. And I understand he would hit on that. Yeah. And I think a Catholic could have a very good response because right before he quotes that, he says right there that they have created a false deity. So,
yeah, I see what you're saying. So it's, when we say, do we pray unto them because through them we pray unto God?
Right.
It sounds like he's critiquing like how we talk about, when you pray when you kind of bow to the image or venerate the image, you venerate the prototype or what it represents. Right. But I think he's saying no, okay. I mean, he's quoting the Psalms there. Yeah, obviously, do they have a mouth? Yeah, so he's saying if you will, we don't treat the image, if you will, as if it were God himself. Right. And that's the distinction that he would draw. And I think that's important because even as a Catholic, right.
Yeah.
I want to be careful, right, to not treat the image of something as if it were God.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. But and to respond to that, I would show the context because as you go forward and you read more of the exposition, Augustine says exactly why this is being condemned. And he says towards the end, he says, even the dead surpass a deity who neither lives nor has lived. So I think the very context of the fact that they are giving this veneration, which amounts to idolatry, to a false deity. I think that really is at the core of what Augustine is condemning. Now, I think when we flip that over and we look at, okay, well, is there any condemnation of Christian kind of artwork? I don't think we find that ever in Augustine. I think anytime Augustine talks about Christian artwork, images in churches, I think he sounds pretty positive towards them. So do we have examples of Augustine offering a veneration to the figure represented in images or artwork? That I do not think you can find in Augustine, but you can definitely find the utilization of images in worship within Augustine, and I think he seems to not have any issue with them at all. Yeah. The other thing, and you brought it up, Suan, and he does it over and over, Augustine, is he will make an emphasis that those in the afterlife, which it comes directly from the Gospels, are more living than they were when they were here on earth. So he doesn't talk about them as if they are dead. And indeed, he very often, in his condemnation of paganism, talks about them as being dead images. They are dead idols. They have never had life within them. And I think that's a very clear distinction. I think that if you read Augustine's writings, because we're also talking about veneration, I think you can get a very good, robust case of Augustine having a belief in the veneration of saints in his teaching. I know we're moving a little bit away from images with that comment, but I did want to make that comment briefly. That is an awesome drinking vessel you have there.
Yeah, I drink lots of water. So just to kind of summarize, because I know this part was a little long, but I just wanted to make sure that I gave Gavin a fair shake too. I think our responses, or the response that we came up with was basically, as you originally said, right? Like if you treat something as an idol, God doesn't want whatever veneration you gave to that idol to somehow go to him, like with the golden calf. If they were to say, oh, we were giving this to Yahweh, it's like, no, Yahweh doesn't want what you were doing with that golden calf, right?
Sure.
And then the second thing that we brought up, though, was the other possibility that Augustine could be talking about is if you treat the image as if it is God himself, right? Right. That's another way to read the question, the rhetorical question, do we pray unto them because through them we pray unto God? That might be a way of dealing with that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Although
to read more, but it is a very good, and yes, you can find it online if people want to read the whole thing. It definitely is a condemnation, a massive one against people he calls heathens.
Well, and the question that I have though is, would Augustine view, let's say, praying to an image of Christ as being illicit, right? Because I mean, the other thing too is, that's kind of an open question in a lot of ways, and you would want to maybe see. I mean, you could maybe make a conclusion or an inference based on what Augustine's saying here that he would condemn that, but I think you would want to be careful. You would want something like you would want more evidence maybe of that.
Yeah, I think we would definitely need more evidence. The reason being is the whole exposition here, the whole commentary really is against idolatry, because I think we would need more evidence of that, because over and over, and I'm looking at it, reading it as I talk with you, he talks about creating a false deity, and that really is the heart of what he's condemning here. I think we would need a whole different context. And I don't think we have that here. I think this is against idolatry. Yeah.
In other words, you have to be careful of the context in which something's originally given, and the extent to which you could expand beyond that original context into other issues.
Sure. Right? Yes.
And that's something that you have to do all the time if you're going to interpret historical documents. Because maybe it sounds like Augustine here would say something that sounds very, like you can't even pray to an image of Christ. Right. Because then that would be treating it as God. Right. Because obviously Jesus is God. Right. So if I'm, praying to Jesus, I'm praying to God. So put all the pieces together. But here, I think Augustine's just kind of assuming run-of-the-mill idolatry. Right. That's the easiest, direct, immediate context that he's thinking of.
Yeah. No doubt. And as I read more, definitely, because he even says to judge the idols of the heathen, they regard not the human figure in them. When they see not the human life, it really is a whole scathing condemnation there against idolatry. But fascinating, now that I was going pretty much throughout the whole context there. I understand where Gavin is definitely coming from, but I don't think the context bears out the point that he's trying to make, because there's not a single kind of condemnation against Christian artwork. And rather, when we do hear about Christian artwork in Augustine, it's in a positive way. In his controversy with the Manichaeans, he says, and now I want to be very clear here. As I said earlier, this is a positive attestation to a biblical event portrayed, pictured within a writing of Augustine. Is there any idea of veneration of images, praying to a saint through an image via Augustine? No. But there's nothing negative within Augustine. Rather, there's a positive attestation when he says, for Abraham, and he's talking to, he's condemning the Manichaean idea that this event would be forgotten to their minds. And he says, Abraham, to sacrifice his son of his own accord is shocking madness. He's doing so at the command of God, proves him faithful and submissive. This is so loudly proclaimed by the very voice of truth that Faustus, eagerly rummaging for some fault and reduced at last to slanderous charges, has not the boldness to attack this action. It is scarcely possible that he can have forgotten a deed so famous. And this is really important, because as he goes on to say, there's no way Faustus could have forgotten of this famous biblical event. Why? That it recurs to the mind of itself without any study or reflection, and is in fact repeated by so many tongues and portrayed in so many places. The Latin literally says that it is pictured in so many places. A lot of the translations say pictured, that no one can pretend to shut his eyes or his ears to it. There's a positive attestation to the utilization of biblical images. And I think that is very, very important in Augustine. And I want to be very clear again. I know the complaints of Gavin and of others that attempt to make a more robust case. Well, they'll say, well, show us a veneration. We promise you today we're responding. We promise, I will give a biblical case for that and a patristic-based case for that as well. What are your thoughts on this here? I would like to get your thoughts here, because I have read numerous scholars, and by the way, evangelical ones, that have said that Augustine very clearly is probably talking about this being pictured, portrayed in churches, which would be quite significant.
Yeah, I recall, I think it might have been a sermon by St. Ephrem or someone, where, or maybe I'm getting my dates mixed up, but basically Gregory of Nyssa would weep whenever he'd see an image of the sacrifice of Isaac, right? The binding of Isaac.
Right.
So I think there is attestation across the church that this was a very popular image depicted. Oh, yeah. Probably in churches or just in so many places, as Augustine says, right? But it was an image that Christians were actively making. So once again, this kind of block of aniconism was never a thing. Now, and I know what Gavin's going to say here. He's going to say, well, I didn't say there was a block of aniconism, right? Or just images. And my point is, based on the presentation,
it comes across as that
that's the impression, right? And you have to be very careful about the impression you give when you're presenting, evidence, right? So when you read behind the text, or when you read kind of putting all the pieces together, all the data together, you see, okay, images were always part of Christian worship and life, or at least that's the overwhelming mainstream majority, right? And so Augustine's simply attesting the same fact here.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. From what I've gathered and I've surveyed the evidence, I think it was definitely the overwhelming case, and I think we'll definitely make that case a robust case for that in part 2. I think this is a good text. I very rarely hear this one brought up. I don't know why that is the case, but it's an important one to bring up. And now this one I want to look at really quick, only for one reason. People may wonder, well, William, why are you even reading Basil? The reason I am reading it is because multiple times through the presentation of Gavin brings up Basil, and he pretty much ridicules the Catechism's quotation of Basil and the utilization of Basil at the Second Council of Nicaea. Now, there's a very famous quote from Letter 360 of Basil, where he talks in a very positive way of venerating images. We're not going to use that. I know that is heavily contested. Now, whether or not I believe it to be legitimate or not, which I think the evidence leans in favor of it, I'm not going to use anything contested. I don't want to. If there are a number of scholars going either which way, I want to respect that. And if I can find examples of images utilized in a positive sense anywhere else, I will utilize that. And in Basil, you can find them in multiple other areas. We don't need to rely on anything that is contested. I know it's heavily contested. And you can find it in his homily in the 40 Martyrs. The way I read it, I'd love to get your thoughts on it. He says, when often both historians and painters express manly deeds of war, the one embellishing them with words, the other engraving them on the tablets, they both arouse many to the bravery. The facts which the historical account presents, by being listened to, the painting silently portrays by imitation. In this very way, let us too remind those present of the 40 Martyrs' virtue, and as it were, by bringing their deeds to their gaze, let us motivate them to imitate those who are nobler and closer to them with respect to the course of their life. That, to me, is very clearly, you call upon their virtue, that is definitely bestowing honor upon their noble and virtuous lives, as he says. They are martyrs. They are no longer living. This goes hand in hand with giving veneration to these great saints through this kind of visible representation. I think that is unmistakably what St. Basil was saying.
Right. I mean, he's saying that you can, through an image, be inspired, yes. Right? Yeah. And let's see, as he says here, the facts of the historical account, which the historical account presents by being listened to, the painting silently portrays by imitation, right? So it's also, I mean, Gavin will talk about the didactic or educational use of images, right? So he, Basil's saying the same thing, that the image does have this kind of, I guess, educational purpose, but also this other purpose of inspiring, of motivating, of increasing virtue.
That is correct.
Right?
Okay. And remember, we talked about earlier, we have to be very, very clear that there are multiple ways of giving veneration and honor. At the heart of Nicaea II is giving honor and veneration. I want to be very clear. Nicaea II's dogmatic decrees did not say we have got to give honor and worship only in this particular way. You worship God and this has to be like this, or you honor and venerate the saints, it has to be this way. No. There are multiple ways to honor the saints. There are many ways to give veneration. I think that when we realize that biblical point, I think we can really move the chain, Suan, because I gathered that from Gavin. And Gavin is free to come back and say, well, you misunderstood me. But I gathered multiple times, because Gavin says it over and over. Okay, well, where's the bowing? Where's the prostrating? Where's the lighting candles? As if there are only particular ways that you can give honor and veneration. Rather, the biblical standard, biblically, there are multiple ways of honoring and venerating a person.
I also want to say, too, I mean, there's a lot that I want to say there, but with what Basil's saying here, I wouldn't be surprised if he thought an image, I mean, could be used, right, to inspire someone, and that at least, so you're saying that you think the quote of the honor given to the type passes to the prototype is authentic. That's your position?
Oh, yeah. No, that one is also Gavin's position as well. But Gavin will say that it is
because the Trinity, right?
Yeah, it's being ripped out of context. But there's a different one. There's a different quote that was quoted by multiple fathers and was it is called Letter 360. It's a different one. Yeah. And you can look that one up. That one is way, way, way heavier on venerating images, and it is heavily contested. But I know that it is not. I want to be very clear for people that may stop and say, well, it's only contested because very clearly you don't find his language about images anywhere else. That is not why scholars contested. By and large, it became a controversial text because of the utilization of Theotokos in that text. But here's the one thing I'd like to dial back. That became a popular way of contesting the validity of that text. But since many years have passed, and the research and study of, in particular, Dr. Massa, showing that Theotokos does predate Basil's particular letter, I think people need to reevaluate that. Because
I see what you're saying.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. For people that are thinking that it is considered pseudonymous because of what he says about images, no, that is not what scholarship has looked at to say that this is contested.
All right, William, I'll let you keep going because I realize we have a lot more to go through.
We sure do, and they're all great, really interesting. Now we've got Arnobius. This one is important to look at because Arnobius says, "What then? Without these, do the gods not know that they are worshipped? What greater wrong, disgrace, hardship can be inflicted than to acknowledge one God and yet make supplication to something else, to hope for help from a deity, and to pray to an image without feeling?" Now, there really isn't a whole lot to go into within Arnobius. We can look at this and then look at what Arnobius says elsewhere and realize it's very clear what Arnobius is doing here. Arnobius is condemning idolatry. He does it in multiple different areas. Here in particular, you see it right there. Without these, do the gods not know that they are worshipped? He's condemning idolatry here. But Arnobius is clear in the fuller context. He says it. Your gods, then, they dwell in plaster and terracotta? Since in the course of the exposition, it has been sufficiently shown how futile it is to make images, we must next speak of sacrifices. The images in the whole context, by the way, this is where Gavin quoted from, are talking about idols. These are gods that dwell in plaster. He concludes the discussion showing it is futile to make these kinds of images. He's not completely against all images. Oops. I'm sorry about that. He's not completely against all images, but I want to be very clear. He also doesn't present a case for veneration of images. Rather, he just doesn't present any kind of case rather than condemning idolatry. Now, again, this was the quote we looked at. The whole context is always important. What is being condemned? The gods that they believe dwell in plaster and terracotta. That is the quote. That is the whole context. And I think, Suan, when we begin unveiling things and unwrapping things, we really realize what is being condemned. It isn't what we think it is in the context.
Yeah, very quickly, I remember the Catholic brothers, they mentioned how there was a lot of anachronism in the way that Gavin used the quotes, because basically anachronism is when you read something from your present context or a later context into an earlier context where it might not so neatly univocally apply, right?
Yeah.
And so here it's like, okay, well, Gavin might latch onto, I'm going to go back in your presentation real quick.
Yeah.
I think Gavin's going to latch onto and pray to an image without feeling.
Yeah.
Right. And, and so he's going to say like, well, they're like, okay, that's the principle. Right. And that principle would prohibit icon veneration. Or he would say something like, if you presented the veneration of icons to Arnobius is going to say, based on what we can tell here, no. Right. And I think what you're doing, William, is you're saying, okay, let's be a bit more careful here, because he is very clearly he's talking about gods who are believed to dwell in images. Yeah. And it's like, well, everybody knows that image has no feeling. So therefore that God is not dwelling in that image. And if that's the case, then even we can agree, right?
100%, definitely. That is the heart of the context where he clearly says they believe they dwell in there. And that very clearly is the heart of idolatry. They believe that they dwell. And he goes on to make, and I didn't quote post everything because it really is a condemnation of believing in. And let me emphasize here where Arnobius says, you pray to an image without feeling. The reason he does that is because elsewhere he condemns the idea that they are alive within this kind of plaster. And so that really is the heart of what he's condemning. They believe that they're alive. They believe they can grant favors. He moves on to the point of sacrifices because people are offering sacrifices to them as if they can grant miracles and wishes to them, truly believing they are alive. That's why he's really emphasizing the idea that, hey, they're not living. They are not gods. And that really is the heart of the condemnation of Arnobius.
Right.
Now, here is one that I'm glad we're going to look at. It is Origen. Now, I want to be very clear. Origen's not an early church father, but just because he's not an early church father, he shouldn't be dismissed. And people could very easily say, well, William, he's not an early church father. You quote him in all of the books you have published. I do. We include him in all the books we publish. In our Mary one we have right here, we include him there because he was an important ecclesiastical figure. Very important. He was a great Greek writer, but not a church father, but either which way. What is the issue here? Because it really does seem like we've got a robust case against images in Origen. And if that is the case, well, what is the deal with later figures of the catechetical school, such as, before him, St. Clement of Alexandria, later Didymus the Blind? What is going on? Is there a part of the church that was just completely against images, completely anti-icon? Because when you read this here, being taught in the school of Jesus Christ, have rejected all images and statues, that is powerful. It's a powerful statement. But in the whole context, we see what's being talked about here. It says, yet they are in error in many matters of belief, but whether Orpheus, Parmenides, Empedocles, or even Homer himself and Hesiod are the persons whom he means by inspired poets. Let anyone show how those who follow their guidance walk in a better way or lead a more excellent life than those who, being taught in the school of Jesus Christ, have rejected all images and statues and even all Jewish superstition. We know what he's talking about and condemning here. And I think the full quote must be shown to see what is being condemned here. There's more than just that, Suan, because I went into the Patrologia Greci, however people want to pronounce it. I know there's some snobs that want to pronounce it a certain way. I'm just going to do it the way where people will probably call me a slob. I'm just going to call it the Patrologia. So, or the Patrologia. But either which way, we know exactly what is being condemned here. It has nothing to do with what I believe Gavin was trying to put forward as a message. But another thing that I did, Suan, and we'll dive in a moment. I want to focus on this before I move forward, because I went and I looked at the Greek. I looked at the translations, and I looked at areas where Origen was quoting from, Greek that was being used. And I don't think that the presentation, and I want to be very clear, I don't think Gavin was trying to mislead people or trying to be dishonest. I just don't think that the quotes were being utilized in a correct fashion. And I want to show the audience how his presentation, particularly on Origen, was incorrect. In particular, the whole of this quote here, he didn't show it. And I think when we look at the whole quote here, what kind of images are rejected? We know which kinds are rejected. And we know that, that Origen doesn't speak negatively of all kinds of images, because in other areas he does talk positively. We'll leave that, though, for the second show, where he does utilize images in a positive fashion.
Right. So that's the key thing, though. Well, one is that when he's talking about images and statues, he's talking about them in the context of all kinds of superstitions, right? And presumably the superstitions would be kind of these kind of Greek philosophers who had, statues and images made of them, and they were almost kind of worshipped in a way.
Absolutely.
So there's that kind of particular cult and those superstitions. But he's not saying he's not saying no to all images and statues, because you also point out, William, that he does speak positively of them, right?
Yeah.
So that's why, kind of cutting it the way that he did kind of read a little weird, it did read quite strange. And also that wouldn't wait, go back real quick.
Yeah.
That wouldn't technically be even the end of the sentence. So you wouldn't even put a period.
No,
right?
You wouldn't.
So
I don't know why you put a period there.
Okay. No. Unless it maybe in Shaft it's that way, or
no,
but then isn't this?
I looked at it.
So this is straight.
Yeah.
Okay. So then that's
and we're being fair here, Suan.
Yeah.
I took that screenshot from his video.
Yeah.
That's directly from the video, and I want to be very fair. I think it's Whether he does it on purpose or does it by accident, I don't know, but he does it very often, multiple times, where the father will be, a little piece will be quoted, or you'll get a period and yet it's not the end of the sentence and it goes on. You find that often. And I think when we really look at the whole context of what Origen is saying here, he really is not saying he's not saying what Gavin wishes he was saying. Mm. And even more so, I went to the Patrologia to look at the particular Greek utilized here by Origen, and he doesn't say anything even remotely similar. Because if we examine the actual Greek text from Origen, contra Celsus, it's actually Origen's condemnation against pagan shrines and statues, not images. There truly is no condemnation against biblical statues or iconography. And as we can see, this particular Greek word employed by Origen highlights the point he was trying to make. It is condemning pagan shrines and statues. Why does the translation then say images? Beats me, Suan. I want to be clear. I looked at others that read differently. It very well could be because this is an old translation. It's one of the old ones you can find online for free. It's an open domain kind of translation there. But it really is not talking about all images, because then Gavin could come back and say, okay, well, he's talking to, sure, he may be condemning the pagans, but he still says all images. The condemnation really is against pagan shrines and statues. It's in the context of paganism. You've got to look at the particular Greek, and I did look at the Greek in the Patrologia, and I even very clearly, I don't want people to just take my word for Googling a Greek word, which, by the way, I don't just Google it. I've got a number of Greek English lexicons, Greek dictionaries that I utilize. I have a lot of them. We utilize, people know very well for the books that we work on, even the work you do. All of us, we utilize scholarly resources. We don't just Google things. So I wanted to present this, the Henry George Liddell and Robert Scott lexicon. They can see the particular Greek word here. And you can very clearly see it's referring to a temple, a shrine. In this particular case, a pagan shrine. So that particular text he presented is problematic, where it says, being taught in the school of Jesus Christ, have rejected all images and statues. It really should read that they're shrines and statues. But what kind of shrines and statues? Very clearly, Origen is talking about pagan shrines and statues.
All right.
So there's more. It is in consideration of these and many other such commands that Christians not only avoid temples, altars, and images, but are ready to suffer death when it is necessary, rather than debase any such impiety, the conception which they have of the Most High God. Another one which reads very interestingly, okay, Christians avoid images. By the way, we know that Christians don't avoid altars. We know that very clearly. Thusiasterion is utilized in the positive sense by Origen multiple times. Altars are used in a positive sense. But either which way, let's say Origen was saying, well, they avoid all images. Really, there's another problem here, because the text actually, but does the text actually speak of images that are being avoided? It doesn't. It employs a particular Greek word. And by the way, for the audience, you don't even need to know Greek. I'm going to break it down for you right now. This particular Greek word is referring to a type of altar, but not just any altar that is being condemned by Origen. Origen is pointing out a pagan altar, exactly like the one referenced in Acts 17. So right here, it doesn't say images. It literally is a pagan altar. It is an altar. The Greek word is talking about a pagan altar. The Greek word you can find directly in Acts 17, where St. Paul says, "For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar." And we know he's talking to the pagans in the Areopagus when he stumbles upon the altar to the unknown God. There you have the very same Greek word. Again, you don't even need to know a lick of Greek to realize the exact Greek word being utilized by Origen here. That exact Greek, and by the way, Gavin Ortlund is a scholar. He very well has the ability to utilize the TLG, the Thesaurus Lingua Grece. He can plug in the Greek of Origen here, and he can compare what Greek word is being utilized here compare the Greek word in the Thesaurus Lingua Grece to the other places where this word is used. The context is very clear. It's a pagan altar that is being referenced. And I think that, and I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt, Swan, I don't think he did this to be deliberately dishonest. I just think he was kind of giving a basic rundown of the information. It was a short video, and I think he was just utilizing quotes, a lot of them where you can find easily online, and a lot of them that are reproduced in anti-icon work. To be honest, Swan, you can find a lot of these quotes on New Advent, where they use the very same word. So I don't think he's being deliberately dishonest or really even dishonest. I just think that he's perhaps didn't do a deep dive.
Right. So it doesn't seem like it's a good translation, but even if you went with that translation in context, you see what kind of altars and such he's talking about, and images, right? Because I remember the implication I believe he had in the video was, oh, look, they don't have altars either. So, and obviously as Catholics, we have altars and all that.
And the idea that you don't find altar utilized in Origen is a problematic. You do find it utilized multiple times. Origen has a very high Eucharistic theology. You find altar utilized multiple times. So that is one point that I'll just make in passing. But I think that I don't think the case, and I want to emphasize, when I did this on Sam's show, I didn't delve into Origen because I was very limited in time. But I know Origen is not venerated. I know he's not an early church father. But I want to say Origen falls in a different category than Tertullian. Origen was very well respected. Even today, when we find works of his, they get great respect because he was a great ecclesiastical writer, not an early church father, though. So Lactantius is the next one. This is important because he does get brought up, and I want to be very fair. Every father that we're going through, and in a bit we'll look at the Council of Elvira as well. I'm reading the quotes as presented by Gavin every now and then, and I want to not forget. Okay, I do have the timestamps. Okay, I have not gotten there yet. I don't need to get to the timestamps yet. But to be fair to Gavin, when we need to, as we did earlier, we will play a clip so that we can show the audience. Okay, and throughout this presentation, I have presented direct screenshots I've gotten from Gavin's presentation. So we are doing everything we can to be fair to Gavin's position. I don't want people to think, well, these guys are just ripping things out of context. We are being as fair as we can. And Lactantius says, if a statue, the resemblance of man, is made by the exercise of design and art, shall we suppose that man himself is made up of fragments which come together at random? And what resemblance to the truth is there in the thing produced, when the greatest and most surpassing skill can imitate nothing more than the mere outline and extreme lineaments of the body? Was the skill of man able to give to his production any motion or sensibility? What artist could have fabricated either the heart of a man or the voice or his very wisdom? Does any man of sound mind therefore think that that which man cannot do by reason and judgment may be accomplished by a meeting together of atoms everywhere adhering to each other? So even though, and now a number of things are presented on Lactantius, I don't find anything that Gavin puts forth, and particularly on Lactantius, to be against all kinds of images. He is against idols, but Lactantius is also does talk about images in a positive sense in his Divine Institutes too. He says, for the plan of making likenesses was invented by men for this reason, that it might be possible to retain the memory of those who have either been removed by death or separated by absence. So whereas Lactantius can condemn idols and images, he can then talk about making likenesses in a positive sense. And in particular, Suan, I think this is an important quote because he's not only talking about images being done in a positive way, but about those that have passed on, those men of good memory. I think that's important.
Yeah, and let me compare this to what Gavin said in his video. So I have the quote here. Were you going to present it?
No, go ahead. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't know what happened to it. I thought I had it there.
Yeah, so here's what the quote says in the video of Lactantius. Wherefore it is undoubted that there is no religion wherever there is an image.
There we go.
For if religion consists, excuse me, of divine things, and there's nothing divine except in heavenly things, it follows that images are without religion, because there can be nothing heavenly in that which is made from the earth. There is no religion in images, but a mimicry of religion. That which is true that is therefore to be preferred to all things which are false. Earthly things are to be trampled upon, that we may obtain heavenly things. So if you just had that quote alone, the one that I just read, right, where it's like images are without religion, all earthly things should be trampled upon, right? You might think he was totally opposed to images, right?
Sure.
But then here he talks about how images have a positive function of remembering your loved ones and those who have died. Right. And then that puts then into context then that at least for him, what he means by religion here has to be something like, you know, you create this earthly thing as if it were a heavenly thing, and it becomes a kind of distraction.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Whereas, you know, so what's going on there needs to be balanced with what's going on here. Right. And then the other thing too, you know, that you have to, so, and for as someone, you know, you're a scholar in this area, you publish in this area. For me, trying to be, you know, trained formally academically, one of the things that you try to do is also read past rhetoric.
Definitely.
Right. So you have to be careful, like, okay, it sounds like he's saying something that could be read as a total condemnation of images, right? But then when you balance this with what you just quoted here, you have to figure out how to put them both together and not have the rhetoric be the only thing that's echoing in your ears.
Absolutely. That's a great point you make there. And I think when we balance everything like Lactantius is saying, and we actually examine the context, it really doesn't bear out. He is not a figure that would be good for the anti-icon position. I can definitely tell you that. A lot of these fathers, in fact, I'm going to argue all of the ones that we look at, and we'll see, we're going to look at more later, none of them present a case that can be utilized by modern day Protestants to say, look, this is an example of anti-icon running rampant in the early church, or even an example of this being present in a major church region. You just don't find that. You don't find that at all.
The key part of the original quote that Gavin cited, I think, is this part where he says, but, you know, there can be nothing heavenly in that which is made from the earth, right? That in might actually be doing a lot more work than we think.
Yes.
Right. It's an in that might actually be saying what we've been saying, what other fathers have been condemning, which is that you can have a deity exist in the object.
Yeah, that was condemned over and over. And I think that really, and we would be on board with Gavin in condemning that. Anything that is an idol, we would condemn. So I think that really is the most important point in really just condemning things that the fathers condemned were idols. That rightly is the thing that must be condemned.
Right. Well, let's get to, I think Elvira is next, right?
Elvira. Oops, I want to rewind that. I don't want to spoil it for the. Let me before we dive into Elvira, let me tell the audience why this is very significant. Number one, I know a lot of people are going to watch this show in the future. Maybe people that never even heard of Elvira. Elvira is not an ecumenical council. It was an early church council in Granada in Spain in the early 300s, 303, 04, 09. It was in the early 300s. And it is a boring council. Now, why do I say it's boring? There's a lot of canons that are not going to entertain you when you go through them and read them. Why has Elvira become famous? Elvira is famous largely because of Canon 36, which is a prohibition against images. I know the arguments brought up from the Catholic side, and I know the arguments brought up from the Protestant side. I have heard the Protestant arguments, and I've heard the Catholic ones. I've heard Catholics say, even very well-intentioned scholars will say, well, look, images were condemned, but they were condemned so that, so they wouldn't, be worshipped or be torn down, or the paganism was rampant in that area. Whatever kind of argument levied by Catholics, Gavin or any other Protestant will come back and they will say, well, look, even if it's a local council, you've got a council, a gathering of a lot of bishops that condemned images in places of religious worship. And it doesn't say, well, I'm condemning them because of this or because of that. It's just condemning them, a blanket condemnation so they don't become worshipped. Now, here is the other thing, Suan. When it comes to Canon 36, we have got to give it its due service. Canon 36, and I want to read it. Canon 36 forbids religious art, and it says, pictures are not to be placed in churches so that they do not become objects of worship and adoration. Whatever reason, whether paganism was rampant in the area or not, which we know it was, a Catholic would be in a bit of a bind if indeed a local council truly did condemn images. Now, the other question would be, did this become widespread? We know it didn't. But either which way, why were they condemned? My position from having researched this for many, many years, Suan, and having read scholars in Spanish and in German, I recognize there's a division, and it's not a tiny division. It's a massive one. You have a lot of scholars that don't believe Canon 36 is a legitimate one, and you have a good amount that do believe it is. But I think at the end of the day, when we present our case, the case that I take, that I believe it's pseudonymous, I don't think it's a legitimate canon. I think that we can come down, really, really make the conclusion that it really is not a legitimate one. And I want to load up this interview I did. And let me pause it real briefly to let the audience know what I went ahead and did. I reached out to Dr. Leva, who is a scholar, one of the few. By the way, I've reached out to multiple different ones, but not all of them want to grant you interviews. And I don't know French, so the ones that replied to me in French, that wouldn't work. I did have one reach out to me in German. Just really wasn't very interested in doing a show. But either which way, I reached out to multiple scholars, those that believe that the canons are legitimate, and those that believe that there are many, many interpolations at Elvira. In particular, Dr. Leva has written a book in Spanish, all on Elvira. And I also spoke to a German scholar that has written a book all in German on Elvira. And I asked Dr. Leva, first off, I asked him to let us know a little bit about himself. And he does around the 4-minute, 20-second mark. And I want to let the audience know, Dr. Leva doesn't know English, or he knows very little English. So the whole interview that I conducted with him was in Spanish. We're going to play little clips here and there, and I will pause and I will let the audience know what Dr. Leva is saying. I'll break it down for them because I do think it's important to not only tell the audience what Dr. Leva is saying, but to present it in its context, because I don't want people to think that I'm misrepresenting him. Let me go ahead and play the clip right here. Yeah, hay mucha gente que lee cosas sobre el concilio de Elvira, pero no hay mucha información que puedes encontrar en inglés. So, Suan, I don't know if you know Spanish. You're nodding, so I'm guessing you understand that.
A little bit, yeah.
So I'm very clear with Dr. Leva. And for the audience that might want to Google it, there's hardly anything you're going to find on Elvira in English. Now, here's the other flip side. On the stuff that I have read in German and Spanish, even that is, with little fragments here and there, has not been as voluminous as the stuff that Dr. Leva and these other scholars have looked at. So I'm very clear with them. There's not a whole lot out there in English. There is in Spanish. There is in German. So I'm asking him, what can you tell us, first off, about yourself, I asked him. Y usted ha escrito un libro todo sobre este concilio, ¿verdad?
Sí, un monográfico.
So he's written a full book just on the Council of Elvira. I mean, you know the guy's a scholar when they write a whole book just on a local council. You got to love that, right, Suan?
Uh-huh.
Yep.
Solamente sobre el concilio.
¿Y nos puedes decir un poquito sobre el trabajo que hace usted? ¿Eres un académico? ¿Eres un teólogo? Un poquito sobre...
Y bueno, soy licenciado en Historia, máster en Patrimonio Histórico y Arqueológico y soy doctorado en Artes y Humanidades.
The guy's a scholar. The guy has a doctorate. People can get it just from hearing. The guy's a historian. He's a bona fide scholar. Now, hopping on to the 12-minute mark is where he begins telling us a little bit about Elvira. Before that, I do ask him, okay, do we have any early manuscripts of Elvira in Greek? He confirms, no, we do not. The earliest are in Latin, which is understandable. At the region that the council was held in, it was in Latin. He also confirms later on in church history, much later, you do find translations that do pop up in Greek, but the earliest ones do not exist in Greek. That is a very clear point he makes. An important one as well. The other point he does make is that a later church council of Toledo would absorb the canons of Elvira. And I don't want to go too far ahead, but keep that in your mind, audience. The fact that we have a later council of Toledo, and by the way, we also have a Isidore Seville, talking about this council absorbing the canons. Keep that in your mind. In a bit, we're going to return to that thought. He does tell us some interesting things here.
La misma ciudad de Granada, Iliberis, no Elvira. Elvira es un nombre árabe. Entonces este sería el concilio iliberritano, ¿vale? O eliberritano.
So it is a Arabic name, Elvira, which was attached to the council later. And a lot of scholars simply refer to it. They'll talk about it as the Council of Elvira. But then when they begin to go into detail about it, they'll note how it's a local council in Granada, Spain. Elvira was attached to it later on in history. And it is a council, as he's about to affirm to us, that really was lost to history. It just, gets forgotten about.
Ambos nombres se coge como... Este sería la celebración del concilio en Iliberis, ¿vale? Que sería o bien la ciudad de Granada o la sierra de Granada.
Muy bien. Spanish people love saying vale over and over. It's very interesting. Just a brief thought. How when I dialogue with Spaniards that talk Spanish, it's very different than the Spanish from Mexico. It's just so different. But for people that may be hearing it, we're saying, William, why are you not translating that? It's just kind of a repetition of his. Don't worry. Every meaty piece of information we get from him, I am going to stop and translate. And this particular portion is very important.
Y bueno, la principal controversia está en este número excesivo de cánones.
The principal controversy, the main issue, as you can see down there as I labeled the video, are in the number of canons of Elvira. So that is the main issue that we encountered. Now, to be very clear, I forgot. I don't know if it's 81 or 89 canons. I think 81. If you Google Elvira, you're going to find 81 canons, I believe. The main controversy of Elvira, and I want to be clear, Dr. Ortlund, when he presented his video, I don't think he did his homework well on him, because a person who, by the way, was positive towards Gavin beforehand, before Gavin rejected his advice to him, I saw the comment where Gavin said, you know what, there is no, the canons are not contested. Show me evidence where they're contested. And I have an actual screenshot of that. They are contested, and they're hotly contested by a number of scholars. The exact number as to which ones are actually from the council and which ones are pseudonymous. Now, here's the other thing, Suan. I want to be very clear. I don't want people to come back and say, oh, well, Suan and William, man, of course they're going to say Canon 36 is pseudonymous, man. I mean, how convenient for you. I want to be very clear. A number of scholars don't just focus on the icon art statement as being pseudonymous, but a whole bunch of them. A whole bunch, and we're going to hear that right now.
Que bueno, piensan que probablemente haya un núcleo principal donde sí posee antigüedad, y que el resto se trata de algunas normativas que había de la Iglesia, dispersos por distintas iglesias, desde la Galaecia hasta la Bética.
Muy bien, y cuando tocamos sobre el tema de canones, hay varios personas. Now, it's very easy to understand what I'm saying because I butchered it. I literally said it in English, pseudo-canon there. I bring it up because, by the way, our interview was long, and he brings up pseudo-canon many times, and I don't want to interrupt him. I don't want to do it, so I wait till the perfect moment to finally say, okay, you've been talking about these pseudo-canons a lot, and then that's when I ask him. Teólogos, doctores de teología, que hay algunos que dicen que los primeros 21 canones. So I tell them right there are a number of doctors, theologians that are doctors in theology. There are a number of scholars as well that have looked at the manuscripts and only believe that the first 20 or 21 canons are actually from Elvira. And I ask him, Dr. Leyva, when you're talking about pseudo-canons, is this what you're talking about? Very clear what I ask him. Son parte de Elvira. Y algunos piensan que nosotros son pseudo-canons. So I ask him right there. There are a lot of them, scholars that believe that the first 21 or 20 or 21 are part of Elvira, and then that the others are pseudo-canons. Now, I don't know or care how they would have crept in or at what year or what have you. That's not my principal interest in this. My interest is if they're not originally part of Elvira and they crept in at a later date, we have a big issue when we bring this forth as evidence of the early church or a part of the early church as being anti-image or anti-icon. And Dr. Leyva answers me. Estás hablando sobre eso, ¿verdad? Cuando usted dice... I ask him point blank, is that what you're talking about? When you talk about pseudo-canons, are you talking about that exact same point? And you see him nod and say, Vale, yes, that is what he's talking about. Now, that is really, really important. I have to emphasize over and over how that's important. But I also want to be fair to Gavin and everyone else, because I am aware of scholars that argue for its authenticity. The problem is this, Suan. The problem is, if on our end, we're going to say, well, look, you know, we know there's pseudonymous texts. You don't want us to utilize Basil's letter 360, and we're not going to utilize it. We're not going to utilize, look, we're not going to utilize any of these contested texts. We're not going to. But then Elvira is trotted out, where there's a massive dividing line. Scholars that don't believe these canons are legitimate, and some that do believe it is legitimate. Why trot it out as if it is a definitive case? I think that's problematic. On the flip side, what an interesting case that later Spanish councils, later ones, would absorb the canons of Elvira.
Yeah.
But Canon 36 is lost to history. What's going on there? Why does Toledo and why do others, there are others, by the way, why do others absorb them, but that one is nowhere to be found? Here's an even more important point. I asked Dr. Leyva in our private correspondence, and I asked, what's his last name? Dr. Wolfley. I asked him as well in our private correspondence, because I could not find this in my research. If they could provide me a list of a lot of bishops that were there at the council, they say, we know a lot of them. A lot of them are unimportant names. Some of them are prominent figures, but some of them are people whose writings we have. Interestingly enough, I asked, said, all right, do we have any evidence that any of these bishops at Elvira were against icons or anything that sounds even remotely anti-icon? There's nothing. My opinion, I am not a scholar. My opinion from having dialogued with multiple scholars is that I do not believe it to be a legitimate canon. But my opinion, what of value is that But the facts are the facts, and they are that this is very contested. So I wish Protestants, which by the way, I want to give credit, a shout out to my friend Francis Tertullian, who during the debate we were having, I thought I had him I'm like, I got him. I got a Tertullian fan. He knows very well to not utilize that argument. He was aware of how hotly contested those canons are. So there are a number of Protestants out there astute to this that don't utilize them. And I think there are some that maybe haven't done all the homework yet that continue trotting out Elvira. To me, Suan, I think the evidence falls in favor of those canons not being part of Elvira. Right. But I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, very quickly, what you're basically saying is at this point, given how well we know that it's hotly debated, if you're going to present it, you need to also defend it. You can't just present it on its own terms, just as a given. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And I think that is the important thing. And again, I am being very fair in the presentation because I also dialogue with scholars that believe it to be a legitimate canon. Issue is that there are many that do not think it is. Many that even say, look, there's a very clear break in continuity with not just here, but in many of the canons after a particular number. So that is something that I really recommend people really do deeper research into. And again, if it is so contested, which it is, my recommendation is not to use it. So that's my number one recommendation. So as I wrote it down here, multiple scholars and historians believe that Elvira is riddled with pseudo-canons. Many only attribute the first 20 or 21. And I wrote that because I also talked to another one that only thought the first 20 were legit. So there's some that believe only 20, some 21 canons to Elvira, meaning canon 36 would be an interpolation or spurious. Dr. Leva notes that many believe only the first few are legitimate. And in my interview with him, he noted that many of the canons of Elvira were later absorbed into Toledo. He also noted that the famous Canon 36 from Elvira, banning images in churches, never made its way into Toledo. As I mentioned earlier, interestingly enough, none of the bishops present at Elvira are on record as anti-icon, anti-image. The recorded names of the bishops and priests of Elvira exist in Latin. So that is a very important point. So again, in the interview with Dr. Leva, he noted that he's aware of the numerous Spanish and German scholars that believe it is not legitimate. But I also, again, I know I'm saying it over and over, but let me emphasize again, we're not only claiming Canon 36 is spurious, rather many say the majority of the canons here are pseudonymous and not part of the council itself.
Yeah, I mean, that's just, historical scholarship right there, because you're pointing out multiple, so it would be like failing to have multiple attestation. You just have this one. Well, yeah, you in a place where you'd expect to see Canon 36 again, when it's absorbed into another council, you don't see it appear again. And then we can study each of the bishops and the priests that were there. None of them seem to be openly aniconic. So that's like two strikes against it.
Yeah, I think and those two strikes are pretty, they're pretty heavy strikes. You're down to the count, you're 0-2. So that's pretty heavy. So I think the other thing is, and the scholars bring it up, this never becomes practice in Spain. If this is a legitimate canon, you would expect any other Spanish council to maybe echo this or repeat it to show that this became a kind of practice, but rather you never find that ever. It just never really just does. Now, I have heard theologians, I've heard a few of them make the argument that because this was found later in history in a primarily Islamic region, that this was a later interpolation made by them. Personally, I cannot say yes or no. I don't know scholars that have either studied that issue or tried to make that claim. I will say this, and I did ask two scholars. Scholars thus far have not been interested in trying to prove that point. Rather, they've been interested in studying other issues. So whether that ends up being the case later on in history or not, who knows? It could be likely. That could happen. I wouldn't rule it out.
Okay. That's a good point, the good qualification.
Yeah.
But it's like right now, the scholarship in favor of the authenticity of Canon 36 and other canons is slim.
Yes, absolutely, very slim. So before we hop onto the next one, this is going to be fun. We're going to look at Saint Epiphanius or Epiphanius, depending how people want to pronounce the name. This is going to be a lot of fun. Now, Saint Epiphanius, he is a saint. He is venerated. So he's a figure that is important to look at. And he does get accused of being an iconophobe, if you will, being against icons. Now, the problem with the iconophobic text of Saint Epiphanius, and by the way, I didn't pull up the text, but I can tell it to you from memory. It's the one of Saint Epiphanius passing by a church and ripping down the image and ordering them to make it into a curtain, just ripping it apart and just being, totally against images. That's a very famous text brought up over and over. Gavin does reproduce it. I'm not sure if he reproduces it. I think he mentions it and reads it out loud. I don't know if he puts the text out there.
It was on the screen. Mm-hmm.
It was. Okay. You know what? Let's be fair to Gavin.
Yeah,
I know exactly where it is now. And you know what? My bad for not uploading that. I've got it right here ready.
A couple of issues that just...
Yeah, it is right around here.
Various church leaders. For example, in the late 4th century, Epiphanius, Bishop of Salamis, relates this incident in a letter to John, the Bishop of Jerusalem. I came to a villa called Anablatha. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Don't know where it is. It's somewhere near Jerusalem. And as I was passing, I saw a lamp burning there. Asking what place it was and learning it to be a church, I went in to pray and found there a curtain hanging on the doors of the said church, dyed and embroidered. It bore an image either of Christ or of one of the saints. I do not rightly remember whose image it was. Seeing this, and being loth that an image of a man, loath, we would say today, I think that's how we pronounce that, loath, as in hesitant or against, that an image of a man should be hung up in Christ's church, contrary to the teaching of the Scriptures, I tore it asunder and advised the custodians of the place to use it as a winding sheet for some poor person. He goes on for a bit, and he's basically saying that he took it away. So he's explaining he sent a new curtain to John to replace the one that he destroyed, and then he makes this request to John. I beg that you will order the presbyter of the place to take the curtain which I have sent from the hands of the reader, and that you will afterward give directions that curtains of the other sort, opposed as they are to our religion, shall not be hung up in any church of Christ. A man of your uprightness should be careful to remove an occasion of offense, unworthy alike of the church of Christ and of those Christians who are committed to your charge. So he's saying this usage of images in the church is against the teaching of Scriptures. It's against our religion. What's interesting is he doesn't seem to think that this needs to be argued for. His relationship with John is strained at this point, but he doesn't seem to be anticipating that there could be resistance to this. He's just kind of assuming this is what we do. This is what Christians do. This is unworthy of the Church of Christ to have those there. Okay. Now, there's a bunch of other passages from Epiphanius where he has a similar view, but they're sometimes disputed. So rather than get into that, I'm not going to go into those.
My problem with that statement there, Suan, is that the way Gavin says it, the way he presents it, is like, okay, well, the others are disputed. I'm not going to focus on the ones that are disputed.
Yeah.
Elvira. One, yeah. Well, Elvira is massively disputed, and this one is massively disputed. Gavin's got to know better. He's got to know that this one is heavily disputed as well. So the problem with the iconophobic text of Saint Epiphanius, many modern-day scholars accept the text condemning icons as authentic, and many don't. St. John Damascene, St. Theodore the Studite, and St. Nicephorus condemned the text as fraudulent, as fakes. They laid out a fantastic case for denying the authenticity of the letters We will examine some of the points that the fathers made against the so-called Epiphanian text. But let us thus far summarize our evidence on iconoclastic evidence versus evidence in favor. Number one, the texts against the usage of images in worship are either heavily contested, don't appear in any writings of the particular father for many centuries. By the way, we'll see that again in a bit. After their death, have different writing style, were heavily contested at Nicaea too, or never even utilized, like Elvira. For our presentation of the positive case, we are not utilizing any contested or spurious texts, such as letter 360 of Basil, has not been entered as evidence. The texts of St. Epiphanius only appear several hundred years after his death. Note, texts appearing, and I want to be fair to Gavin, texts appearing at a later date does not automatically disqualify their authenticity. It doesn't. I have to be fair. I.e., Theotechnos, Origen, new texts discovered, and Augustine. We've discovered new texts, by the way, that are just being translated right now. I know that your father copied. So I'm not making the argument that texts appearing at a later date automatically disqualifies. No, I'm not. But there's a problem when these only appear being quoted at Nicaea 2 when you've never heard of them before and they're being quoted to negatively to show a negative case of images and icons when they were never utilized before. Now, what would disqualify their authenticity is if the style of writing and or theology would clearly be at odds with the writing and theology in the non-contested corpus of Epiphanius. For instance, it is suspect that no one was aware of the particular heresy and or writings that Epiphanius is talking about until the controversy over images erupted. Much like St. Jerome was aware of the 7 authentic Ignatian corpus letters, thus verifying that we have the correct collection of texts from the Antiochian bishop. These extra texts are highly suspect. They're first quoted by the iconoclasts, and the great fathers immediately denied their authenticity. St. John Damascene begins to laugh. He begins to laugh at this. They don't accept them. A number of modern day scholars don't either. They don't believe they're real. It is St. John Damascene who first mentions these iconophobic texts from St. Epiphanius. He immediately notes they're fake. Second Nicaea and the Iconodules note that no such kind of heresy that Epiphanius is supposedly condemning in these contested works is ever listed in the Panarium. Why doesn't he list it in the Panarium, where he begins talking about heresy after heresy? He's known for being a heresy hunter. Why not list this? These texts are never heard of prior to the explosion of iconoclasm. St. Nicephorus notes clear contradiction in the contested texts and those of the actual corpus of St. Epiphanius. From here on forward, I will refer to these as pseudo-Epiphanius. Seems to have an issue with proskuneo, prostration, and various types of veneration being given to saints, not only directed to images. And Suan, I want to recall the audience to the famous Panarian, the famous one, where he is condemning the Collyridians. Remember, he's a heresy hunter. But he doesn't just condemn them because they're venerating Mary. No, they're worshiping Mary. He says, you don't offer the Eucharist to Mary. You don't do that. You don't worship Mary. But he goes forward, Suan, and he says there is a proper way of venerating Mary. She's more venerated than other saints. So pseudo-Epiphanius, no prostration, no proskuneo, no kind of veneration. Yet Epiphanius, in the corpus that we know is actually him, has no issue with veneration, proskuneo, in the proper context. This clearly seems to fly in the face of the language of St. Epiphanius as he condemns the Collyridians, where he notes that there is a proper way to venerate and honor the saints, but offering latria to Mary would be idolatry. Pseudo-Epiphanius seems to be a completely different person. It just doesn't fit, Suan. It really doesn't fit at all.
And what you're saying is the pseudo-Epiphanius, his texts were found later, and among these later texts is this event where he tears down this curtain and reacts in this way.
That is correct. That
Okay.
that is heavily contested as well. And which again, I think Gavin, like, I don't want to accuse Gavin of being dishonest or trying to mislead anybody, but the way he words it as if, you know, there's other texts, but those are contested, I'm not going to read those.
Yeah.
Well, the very one you read is the one that's contested. That is the one that is heavily contested by the defenders of icons and images. The great fathers, Theodore, John Damascene, Nicephorus, they laugh it off as a fake. It doesn't fit. The theology simply doesn't fit with the real Epiphanius. There are also Christological problems with a man who previously was able to make key distinctions in his writings. By the way, I read them. I've read them. I'm not just Googling and quoting scholars. I read them. For instance, Pseudo-Epiphanius has no issue affirming Christ is of the very same nature as the Father, but he's very confused and he hesitates to affirm whether or not Christ is of the same nature as Mary. Did he receive flesh from Mary? The texts from Pseudo-Epiphanius border on Manichaeism. There are numerous contradictions. In two of the texts we have competing origins of him. One tells us he was born into a Jewish family, whereas the other says he was born into a family of Catholics that were faithful to Nicaea and Orthodoxy. Well, which one is it? You know, did he change his kind of origin story? You know, he woke up and forgot about it. So there are numerous contradictions. It smacks of forgery. And I've got to say, I think now, I know some people might say, well, you know what, William, you know, the fathers didn't always use documents that weren't forged. Both sides at Nicaea too were guilty of this. The iconodules were guilty. The iconoclasts were guilty. But the problem is that today we've mopped up as best as we can, and we're not using any of these contested texts. Why are our evangelical friends still utilizing ones that are heavily contested? Elvira becomes popular at the Reformation, begins getting utilized, and many of these other texts. And we say, look, we realize you contest these. These are heavily contested. We're not entering them into the dialogue. Let's come to the table and have a healthy discussion. We believe the healthy discussion is going to lead us to believe that the Catholic view on veneration of images and icons has a robust case in the early church, but we don't want to enter texts that are heavily disputed like this into the discussion. And I think for right reason, I think the fathers had a good case against them.
All right, William, I'm ready to keep going.
Awesome. Definitely. Yes. So we get to Eusebius. Now, here is a figure that when I did the show with Sam, I avoided Eusebius as well. And let me also add another thing. Before we delve into Eusebius, he was largely avoided at Nicaea too as well. Why is that? The iconodule said, he's yours. We don't care. We don't care. Why was that? Why did Nicephorus not care? Why did they, in essence, later not really care? Eusebius has a checkered history with Arianism, refusing to put his name to originally sign his name on the creed, and having all kinds of problems in his theology. By and large, he is not venerated in the apostolic churches. Would I accuse him outright of heresy? I wouldn't go that far. I think his views evolved later on in life, but either which way, not venerated. Was basically, the father said, Arianism, we don't care, keep him. But he's a valuable figure, particularly because of his church history, his knowledge as a church historian. And I think when we look at Eusebius of Caesarea, you have another case of heavily contested works that are very clearly, in my opinion, forged. But I want to do this. I want to say, even if we say that they're not forged, I don't think that those against images and icons, I don't think they have any case at all. Number one, Eusebius in his Church History, Book 7, he reads, they say that the woman with an issue of blood, who, as we learn from the sacred gospel, received from our Savior deliverance from her affliction, came from this place, and that her house is shown in the city, and that remarkable memorials of the kindness of the Savior to her remain there. But the gates of her house a brazen image of a woman kneeling with her hands stretched out as if she were praying. Opposite this is another upright image of a man made of the same material, clothed decently in a double cloak, extending his hand towards the woman. At his feet, beside the statue itself, is a certain strange plant which climbs up to the hem of the brazen cloak and is a remedy for all kinds of diseases. They say this statue is one of Jesus. It has remained to our day, so that we ourselves also saw it as we were staying in the city. Nor is it strange that those of the Gentiles who of old were benefited by our Savior should have done such things, since we have learned also that the likenesses of his apostles Paul and Peter and of Christ himself are preserved in paintings, the ancients being accustomed, as it is likely, according to the habit of the Gentiles, to pay this kind of honor indiscriminately to those regarded by them as deliverers. Now let's break it down. Here he is talking of Christians in the city, venerating the images, talking about the brazen cloak, even as a remedy for all kinds of ailments. So even before we get into the text, which we will do in a moment, iconoclasts are going to run into a number of problems when dealing with Eusebius. Number one, we recognize he's not a saint, venerated in any of the churches. Number two, he's affirming that the practice is an ancient one, the practice of venerating images. But as we played a little while ago, I want to play the video of Gavin. Could you add that briefly? I want to play.
I deal with that more in the book.
His portion on Eusebius, because we want to be totally fair. And he does bring him up right here. We go.
Even in the 4th century, there's still a lot of the aniconic rigor of a Tertullian or a Clement of Alexandria and so forth. The church historian Eusebius seems to be of this mindset. At one point, he writes a letter to Constantia. That's Emperor Constantine's sister. Evidently, she had requested an image of Christ from him. Now, Richard Price, in his commentary on this, suggests from that images must have been rare at this time. Images of Christ must have been rare at this time because you have a wealthy person trying to hunt one down like this. But what's so interesting is Eusebius's response. He rebukes her for this request. He talks about Christ's divine nature, Christ's human nature. He makes this whole appeal that you can't depict either one. Depicting Christ in his human nature and in his glorified state is both impossible and unlawful. And he basically is asking Constantia, how can you even ask me this? He says, can it be that you have forgotten that passage in which God lays down the law that no likeness should be made either of what is in heaven or what is in the earth beneath? Have you ever heard of anything of the kind, either yourself in church or from another person? Are not such things banished and excluded from churches all over the world? And is it not common knowledge that such practices are not permitted to us alone? Now, how do you even say it's strong enough after a patty? He's saying it's common knowledge. Okay. By the way, Eusebius is the father of church history. His knowledge of the church in its early history is second to none. Can anyone take it seriously that venerating icons was an apostolic practice when you've got Eusebius saying that it's common knowledge that images are banished and excluded from churches all over the world? That passage alone. Now, some people dispute the authenticity of it, again, precisely because it is so decisive. But the best of scholarship, in my book, I reference an important 1981 article that goes through all the internal evidence, all the external evidence, says, no, we have no reason to question that this is Eusebius, and we have many reasons to question that it's spurious.
What I want to do today, I'm going to give it to Gavin. I'll give it to him that's Eusebius. We're going to give it to Gavin, even though it's very, very contested. We're going to find that giving that to Gavin is going to do no favors to him at all. Because as we go forward, we have a timeline. Now, this is a timeline that's very important because we're going to look at the timeline of the writings, and I broke them down. This timeline is going to mention positive testimony of images. Then we're going to get to Life of Constantia, where we're going to give it to Gavin and say, okay, well, even though it's contested, we'll say it's legitimate for you if you want to go there. So in his history, around 303, we have this text that we read earlier. So we have an example of a positive testimony. We also have him saying in his history, calling this a wonderful memorial of the benefit the Savior conferred upon her. It is not at all surprising the Gentiles should have expressed their gratitude thus. So you have church history, early 300s. So let's go forward in the Eusebian timeline. Church history, early 300s. We have a middle gap. The letter to Constantia. He apparently becomes iconophobic here, rejects the image of Christ. Now, whether that's Eusebius or not, Eusebius. The only claim to fame of Eusebius being an iconophobe, I put phone there, hopefully that doesn't dismiss everything I've done. Is in this greatly disputed letter of his. Here, Eusebius is shocked at Constantine's half-sister, asking for a picture of Christ. He chastises her for asking for such a thing. Reminder once more, this letter is unheard of before the Council of Hieria in the mid-8th century. Another letter that it doesn't get brought up until the controversy of iconoclasm. So in this letter here, now people may ask, when was that written? Scholars are dating that to probably around 320, between 320 to around 324. So we have positive testimony early in his life. We have testimony, by the way, I didn't list all of it. There are multiple positive testimonies in his history. Then we have his letter to Constantia, which is claimed to be against icons and images. But then we've got the end of his life, in his life of Constantine, around 338 to 340, where he does talk about images in a positive way. In book 3.3, he talks about an image of the cross and a dragon as a true and faithful representation. In fact, he says, on the other hand, one might see the fountains in the midst of the marketplace, graced with figures representing the good shepherd. We know, Suan, that was a very common image utilized. Well known to those who study the sacred oracles, and that of Daniel also with the lions, forged in brass and resplendent with plates of gold. Indeed, so large a measure of divine love possessed the emperor's soul that in the principal apartment of the imperial palace itself, on a vast tablet displayed in the center of its gold-covered paneling ceiling, he caused the symbol of our Savior's passion to be fixed, composed of a variety of precious stones, richly inwrought with gold. The symbol he seemed to have intended to be, as it were, the safeguard of the empire itself. Number one, Eusebius is really confused. If that letter is legitimate, by the way, scholars do contest it. I know some believe it's real. But if it is real, Eusebius really was a flip-flopper. And he was also incorrect in claiming that these images were unheard of. It doesn't make sense, does it?
Yeah. No, as soon as given everything we've talked about, as soon as I heard the quote, the contents of it, I'm like, even if this is authentic Eusebius, he's just flat out wrong that it's banished all over the world from churches.
100% wrong.
That's just flat out wrong. So,
yep.
Yeah, even if it is authentic, then that's just something of Eusebius that we can demonstrably show is false.
And even if it is authentic, and even if we give that to Gavin, it would merely show Eusebius was a flip-flopper, but that at the end of his life, he was positive towards images and icons. So even if you want to say that was negative iconophobia there, what do you do with the fact that his writing towards the end of his life, and by the way, Suan, for the purpose of time, I could have put many more. It is replete with the utilization of images in a positive way, where he calls them true and faithful representations over and over. Over and over, he includes them in a positive sense. So even if we say it's legitimate, there's a problem, because he would have flip-flopped. Did he then reject his iconophobia towards the end of his life and show a positive, that images can be used in a positive way? I mean, if you want to go down that route, you can definitely do it. I personally do not think it is legitimate, but even if we grant it to be a legitimate text. It does no favor because at the end of his life, he clearly shows a favorable attitudes towards images and even calls multiple ones, religious ones, true and faithful representations, and talks about them being resplendent in many ways, representing icons in a positive way.
Yeah, really quick. So, somebody could say when he says true and faithful, that just means that they're accurate. Right.
Yeah.
But then you're saying that, are you saying from there or from somewhere else, he actually gives like something more positive, like, oh, these are actually good for the faith or something like that?
Yeah, I think he does. I think he does indicate that in particular, because if you go forward and read, he'll even say that this rightly does safeguard or protect the empire. And there's one where, see if I can find it, if I included it here.
And also this will probably go into the positive evidence presentation.
Yeah. Oh, no doubt. Yeah. By the way, we have more text that we will show in the positive evidence. Yeah.
Right.
So right here, he definitely indicates positive attitude here, where he says, so large a measure of divine love possessed the emperor's soul. So he's very clearly showing a very positive attitude towards these images, he even calls them figures that represent the good shepherd. So it's very positive towards images. So even if we take that anti-icon text as a legitimate one, Eusebius definitely would have flip-flopped, and at the worst case scenario, he ended his life speaking positively of icons and images. He definitely does no favors for the anti-icon position at all.
It's interesting that he calls it divine love, right?
Yes.
Because if it is divine love, then obviously it's good, right?
Right.
And he wouldn't call it divine love if he thought it wasn't good. So
that is correct.
It inspired, the image inspired something good.
Now, Suan, we're a long ways away from the letter to Constantine's half sister, where it really sounds like get rid of these images. They're not acceptable anywhere. We're a long ways from that, and that alone, letter to Constantia, that alone, I personally believe it to be pseudonymous. I know scholarship is divided. Whether Gavin wants to say the best scholarship says it's real, it becomes a matter of, well, my scholar can beat up your scholar kind of a thing. Because and I don't mean that literally. It's a figurative way of saying that, well, okay, your scholar's better than mine. I think really, let me add that other thing. The reason the fathers at Nicaea, again, really didn't care to delve into this particular issue was Eusebius was not received with great respect. Gavin may not be aware of that. He really does lend a lot of support to Eusebius, like, oh, what a great church historian. He was a great church historian, but he was not venerated in the apostolic churches, particularly because he was rejected because of his Arianism. So I believe I think we conclude with Pope St. Gregory the Great. But I want to give a little bit of a teaser to the audience. Well, let me read the text, then I'll give the audience a bit of a teaser. So Pope St. Gregory, usually we hear, let's read them all. The first quote: if for this instruction, for which images were anciently made, you wish to have them in the church, I permit them by all means, both to be made and to be had, and explain to them that it was not the sight itself of the store which the picture was hanging to attest that displeased you, but the adoration which had been improperly paid to the pictures. This book comes after book 9, where he is condemning. But what is he condemning? He's condemning adoration, but not merely adoration like, okay, well, let's read it. Furthermore, we notify to you that it has come to our ears that your fraternity, seeing certain adorers of images, broken through down these same images in churches. And we commend you indeed for your zeal against anything made with hands being an object of adoration. But we signify to you that you ought not to have broken these images, for pictorial representation is made use of in churches for this reason, that such as are ignorant of letters may at least read by looking at the walls what they cannot read in books. Your fraternity, therefore, should have both preserved the images and prohibited the people from adoration of them, to the end that both those who are ignorant of letters might might have wherewith to gather in knowledge of the history. The people people might by no means sin by adoration of a pictorial representation. I know what Gavin will say. I know what Protestants will say. They'll say, well, look, this is exactly why we say images are okay. They can make representation. They can provide representation, bring to mind certain kinds of events. The thing is this. The main complaint at Nicaea II, the main complaint by the reformers, Francis Turretin and many others, I don't mean Turretin fan, I mean the real Francis Turretin, in his Institutes of Eclectic Theology and other areas, was the condemnation of images in places of worship. That was a primary thing being contested. Maybe some fathers at Nicaea II didn't have that all on their mind, but that was the main thing being contested by the reformers. Clearly, that is not a problem for Pope Gregory. Mm-hmm. What is a problem? A problem is the word being used by Pope St. Gregory for adore. He's talking about not merely venerating or honoring. He's talking about worship being given to them. Clearly says right here, we commend you for your zeal against anything made with hands being an object of adoration. He's talking about them being given worship, not merely, okay, well, we're going to give veneration and honor to the figure being represented there. Actually, here, this is a condemnation against idolatry. And you'll see that very clearly. I want to give the audience a little bit of a teaser before you give me your thoughts here. The teaser being, there are texts that I have found in Pope St. Gregory that I don't think have been brought into the discussion or dialogue has been made on them, where I clearly think he talks about images in other areas as well in a very positive way that we will dialogue about when we do talk about the positive evidence of veneration of icons of images.
Yeah, I mean, so as you pointed out, it's the word adoration, right?
Yeah.
And Gavin might say, oh, well, there was no distinction. And actually, he does deliberately say this. Before Nicaea II, there was no distinction between adoration and veneration, or between worship and veneration. And that is just flat out wrong.
Big time.
Right?
Yeah.
Flat out demonstrably wrong. And so if we can show that Gregory, somehow knew about the distinction, then that could help us see better into what he means by the word adoration. And actually, now I want to bring up the quote by Augustine really quick so that people know.
I was about to do that. I'm glad you're going to do that. Yeah.
Okay. Let me see
looking
here.
for it. I don't know if you have it.
I have it.
I got it. See, maybe you can find it.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to pull it up on your screen?
Yeah. Let me see if I can. You know what? That's the wrong one. I thought I had it.
I can pull it up.
So, I believe it's City of God, book 8 or book 10 or book. I'm trying to remember. Do you have it though?
Well, so I have a quote from this is one that Eric Ibarra gave me, and it's from Contra Faustum, book 20, if I have the Roman numerals right. So here's what he says. This is what Augustine says. We, the Christian community, assemble to celebrate the memory of the martyrs with ritual solemnity, because we want to be inspired to follow their example, share in their merits, and be helped by their prayers. Yet we erect no altars to any of the martyrs, even in the martyrs' burial chapels themselves. No bishop, when celebrating at an altar, so there are altars in Christianity that are valid, where these holy bodies rest, has ever said, Peter, we make this offering to you, or Paul to you, or Cyprian to you. No, what is offered always to God, who crowned the martyrs. We offer in the chapels where the bodies of those he crowned rest, so the memories that cling to those places will stir our emotions and encourage us to greater love, both for the martyrs, whom we can imitate, and for God, whose grace enables us to do so. Okay, here's the kicker. So we venerate the martyrs with the same veneration of love and fellowship that we give to the holy men of God still with us. And then he goes on a little bit. Let me skip a little bit to this part now. But the veneration strictly called worship or latria, that is, The special homage belonging only to the divinity is something we give and teach others to give to God alone. So, let me see if I can find anything else.
He does repeat that also in City of God. Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, so what Augustine's saying here is they know the distinction between veneration and worship. So that's pretty straightforward.
Let me try and see if I can share my screen real quick. I want to read one
from City of God.
Yeah, this is a really good one. Let me know. Oh, let me see. I hit the right button. Let me see. Let me know if that worked. That work?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, here we go. For this is the worship which is due to the divinity, or to speak more accurately, to the deity, and to express this worship in a single word, as there does not occur to me any Latin term sufficiently exact. I shall avail myself, whenever necessary, of a Greek word, latria. Whenever it occurs in Scripture, is rendered by the word service, but that service which is due to men, and in reference to which the apostle writes that servants must be subject to their own masters. Ephesians 6:5, by the way, that's where dulia is used. Dulia is used here. Is usually designated by another word in Greek, whereas a service which is paid to God alone by worship is always or almost always called latria. And he goes onward to talk more and more in depth. I think that's a really robust example that he's using there, showing that there clearly was in the early church a distinction. And by the way, for the audience, I'm going to show that without a shadow of a doubt, Pope St. Gregory, when he is talking about that, he's talking about worship being given in an improper fashion. And we're going to show that when we do give the positive evidence case, because there are more quotes to look at from Pope St. Gregory.
Yeah, the very last thing I want to say here is, the opening line of, let me actually pull it up on the screen. The opening line of Book 11, letter 13 is or rather the excerpt. I don't have the source in front of me. If for this instruction for which images were anciently made, you wish to have them in the church.
Yeah.
So notice it's like, okay, it's Gregory's testimony now versus Eusebius's, if we take Eusebius's to be correct, right?
Right.
So it's not common knowledge apparently that images are forbidden everywhere in all churches, and even from the beginning. So anyway, I think that this is really important. And so did you say that there's evidence that Gregory knows the difference between adoration and veneration?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, so then if that's the case, then that even gets us closer to what was going on here. And this is why, I'm going to say this, William, like, I think part of what you've shown with this presentation is that you have to be careful about anachronism, right?
No doubt.
So it might be the case that the argument of the original father or source is only meant to be read within that original context, and to try and expand it into what eventually became at issue in Nicaea 2 could be illegitimate, right? So you're going to have to do more legwork, right, to show that it's connected somehow in a relevant way. Definitely. The second thing is you have to do the legwork to show that, this is not a contested text and that you can admit it without controversy as an authentic text.
Definitely.
And then the third thing is, what we've shown is veneration was known. Images were in the mainstream always.
Definitely.
Right?
Yep. From the very beginning.
So I think what you've done, William, brilliantly is you've nuanced a lot of things. Now, along the way, we might get some pushback. We might kind of maybe nuance some of our own responses, and we welcome that.
Definitely. We do. Right? We recommend, I want to emphasize again for people maybe barely tuning in, we really emphasize, let us know what you thought in the comments down below. If you liked it, let us know. If you hated it, let us know. We won't get offended. We're not going to cry about it. And if you come back and say, well, why didn't you cover this or that? We're going to cover a whole lot more with the positive evidence. Yeah. Suan and myself were talking a lot behind the scenes, and we said, look, there's a lot to present, a whole lot. And I don't want to cut any corners for the sake of a massive show. So I said, you know what? Maybe we can do multiple ones. 2 seems like we'll get everything done that we need to get done to really give you a robust case. At the end of the day, I think that even if you're just in the fence for this, I think you're going to say, well, look, I get why the Catholics hold to their position now. Maybe I need to re-examine mine a little bit more. because the evidence really is not as robust as I perhaps thought it was. And I don't think the anti-icon evidence is good at all.
Yeah, well, William, it is getting late, so maybe we'll kind of save questions for another time.
For sure.
But
Definitely.
I appreciate you coming on, and I, just want to wish you the best, William.
Brother, I had an incredible time with you. Again, I had a wonderful Friday evening. I can't think of a better way to pass it than to pass it in your presence, my dear brother, and with this great audience. I say that from the bottom of my heart. I love doing this. I love talking with you. I love your channel. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for having me here and allowing me to present and to share my love for the Catholic faith.
Well, William, you're just talking to an icon of me.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
Okay, well, sorry about that. You know what? I'm going to just share really quick, too. There were some fans who helped me get, because they're very, well, together they're expensive. They were able to get me John of Damascus's 3 treatises on the divine images. I want to thank my patrons. And they also got me Father Price's The Acts of the Second Council of Nicaea.
Ooh,
so
that's heavy. That's expensive.
That is expensive. So hopefully I'll be able to contribute more substantively in the future.
Yeah, I do want to mention because the amount of work that goes into doing scholarly work, it costs money. And at the end of the day, a lot of the work that we do, you end up spending much more than you get. We do what we do because we love the faith. I haven't, ever since I become Catholic, I've had a massive fire in my belly, and it has not dwindled at all. It is just growing and growing. By the grace of God, may the Lord preserve us to the very end, brother. And I want to say for people that support you and your channel, keep supporting, and please leave a message down below for the algorithm. Hit like, share, subscribe. I mean, you're doing great things. You're an incredible, masterful apologist. You're a great human being above all, brother. And you're an example of a true brother in the faith. And I'm really thrilled to have spent the evening here.
All right. Thank you, William. And I wish you a good night. And I wish all of our viewers a good night.